300 million years, that is how long this story has waited to be told. Long before the first tyrannosaur opened its jaws, long before the first sauropod shook the ground with its footsteps, long before any creature we would recognize as a dinosaur drew breath upon this planet, there existed a world so alien, so profoundly different from the one we know, that it might as well have belonged to another planet entirely. And in that world, ruling with patience and silence and devastating precision, there lived a dynasty of predators whose reign lasted not for millions of years, but for tens of millions, for over 100 million years across shifting continents and changing skies. They were the Temnospondyls, and they were, by any reasonable measure, among the most successful large predators this planet has ever produced. But you have almost certainly never heard of them. That is not your fault. Our collective imagination, shaped by museums and films and childhood picture books, has been trained to begin the story of life's great predators with the dinosaurs. We jump from the earliest fish to the age of reptiles as though nothing of consequence happened in between. We glance at the Carboniferous period and see only giant insects. We skim past the Permian and note only that something terrible happened at its end. The creatures that actually dominated those ages, the ones that sat at the top of food chains for longer than most dinosaur lineages existed, have been pushed into the footnotes of natural history. They have been forgotten not because they were unimportant, but because they do not fit neatly into the narrative we prefer to tell. Today, we are going to correct that. We are going to go back, far back, past the age of mammals, past the age of dinosaurs, past the great Permian extinction that nearly sterilized the Earth, and we are going to spend time in a world that was dominated not by land but by water. Not by dry plains and open forests, but by swamps, by rivers, by vast and interconnected wetland systems that stretched across entire continents. And we are going to meet the creatures that mastered those environments with a body plan so effective, so perfectly attuned to its surroundings, that it persisted through climate shifts, through continental rearrangements, through ecological upheavals that destroyed countless other lineages. This is the story of the world before the dinosaurs. This is the story of the Temnospondyls, and it begins in the water. Imagine standing at the edge of a body of water roughly 300 million years ago, during what geologists call the late Carboniferous period. The first thing you would notice, before you even looked at the water, would be the air. It would feel thick, heavy. The oxygen concentration in the atmosphere at this time was significantly higher than it is today, perhaps 35% compared to our 21%. You would feel almost lightheaded, almost intoxicated by the richness of each breath. The air would be warm, humid, saturated with moisture that clung to your skin and condensed on every surface. Now look around you. The landscape is green, impossibly green, but it is not the green of grass or flowers because neither of those things exist yet. Flowering plants will not appear for another 170 million years. Grass will not evolve for another 250 million years. Instead, the green comes from other sources. Towering lycopsid trees, their trunks covered in diamond-patterned bark, rise 30 or 40 meters into the air. Giant horsetails, their segmented stems as thick as your torso, cluster along the waterline. Ferns of every description carpet the ground, some small and delicate, others with fronds the size of a car. The understory is dense with mosses and liverworts and 100 varieties of plant life that have no modern equivalent. Everything is growing. Everything is competing for light and space. And everything, without exception, is associated with water, because water is everywhere. This is not a landscape with rivers running through it. This is a landscape that is essentially one enormous interconnected wetland system. The rivers do not have well-defined banks. They spread out across flat terrain, braiding and splitting and rejoining, creating an endless network of channels and pools and backwaters. Between the channels, the ground is soft, saturated, often submerged beneath a few centimeters of standing water. True dry land exists, certainly, on higher ground and ridgelines, but the dominant habitat, the habitat that covers the greatest area and supports the greatest diversity of life, is the swamp. And the swamp is alive with sound. Not the sounds you might expect from a modern wetland, not the calls of frogs or the songs of birds, because frogs as we know them do not yet exist, and birds will not appear for another 150 million years. The sounds of this place are stranger. The buzz and whir of insects, some of them enormous by modern standards. The rustle of millipedes moving through leaf litter, some of them more than 2 meters long. The splash of something breaking the surface of the water, and then the silence that follows. The heavy, pregnant silence of a world where the most dangerous things are the things you cannot see. Look at the water itself. It is dark, stained brown and black by tannins leaching from the decomposing plant matter that accumulates in unimaginable quantities in these swamps. The coal deposits that will one day give this period its name, The Carboniferous, the coal-bearing age, are being laid down right now, right here, as layer upon layer of dead plant material sinks into oxygen-poor water where it cannot fully decompose. The water is warm, shallow in most places, deeper in others, and its surface is often covered with a thin film of algae and floating plant debris that makes it nearly opaque. And beneath that surface, something is watching you. It has been watching you since you arrived. It noticed your footsteps through the vibrations they sent through the soft ground. It detected your presence near the waterline through the faintest pressure changes in the water around it. And now it is lying absolutely still, its wide, flat body pressed against the muddy bottom, its enormous head oriented toward the bank where you're standing, its eyes positioned on top of its skull like the eyes of a modern crocodile, barely breaking the surface. It does not move. It does not need to move. It has been in this position for hours, perhaps longer, expending almost no energy, its metabolism ticking over at the lowest possible rate, waiting for something to come close enough to the water's edge, waiting for a vibration, a ripple, a pressure change that matches the signature of prey. And when that signal comes, it will strike with a speed and violence that seems impossible for a creature of its size and apparent lethargy. This is a Temnospondyl. And you have just entered its world. To understand what the Temnospondyls were, we need to first understand what they were not. They were not dinosaurs. They were not reptiles. They were not modern amphibians, although they are related to them in ways that paleontologists continue to debate. They occupied a branch of the vertebrate family tree that diverged from the lineage, leading to reptiles and mammals very early in the history of land-dwelling vertebrates, and they represent an experiment in body design, in ecological strategy, in the fundamental question of how a large predator should relate to the boundary between water and land, that was spectacularly successful for an extraordinarily long time. The name Temnospondyl itself tells us something important about these animals. It comes from Greek roots meaning cut vertebra, and it refers to the distinctive structure of their spinal column. In Temnospondyls, each vertebra was not a single solid piece of bone as it is in most modern land vertebrates. Instead, each vertebra was composed of multiple separate elements, distinct pieces that fit together but were never fully fused. This might sound like a weakness, like an incomplete or primitive arrangement, and indeed for many years paleontologists treated it as exactly that, as evidence that Temnospondyls were somehow unfinished, halfway creatures that had not yet evolved the fully developed skeleton needed for life on land. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. The multi-part vertebral structure of Temnospondyls was not a limitation, it was an adaptation. In the soft, yielding, unstable substrates where these animals spent most of their time, a rigid spinal column would have been a disadvantage. A spine made of interlocking but flexible components allowed for a degree of lateral undulation, a side-to-side movement that was ideal for propelling a large body through shallow water and across muddy surfaces. It provided support without sacrificing the flexibility needed for the sinuous, flowing locomotion that characterizes animals adapted to aquatic and semi-aquatic environments. The Temnospondyl spine was not unfinished, it was specialized. It was optimized for a world that no longer exists but that, for over 100 million years, was the dominant terrestrial environment on Earth, and the spine was just the beginning. The entire Temnospondyl body plan speaks to a creature exquisitely adapted to life at the interface of water and land. Consider the skull. In most Temnospondyls, the skull was wide and flat, much wider than it was deep, with a shape that has been compared to everything from a toilet seat to a boomerang to a manhole cover. This is not an accident of evolution. A wide, flat skull serves multiple functions in a semi-aquatic ambush predator. It provides a broad platform for the attachment of powerful jaw-closing muscles. It allows the eyes and nostrils to be positioned on the top of the head so that the animal can lie almost entirely submerged while still seeing and breathing. And it creates a hydrodynamic shape that can be snapped upward through the water with minimal resistance when the animal strikes at prey. The teeth of Temnospondyls tell their own story. Most species had rows of small to medium-sized teeth lining the edges of the jaw, suitable for gripping slippery prey like fish and other aquatic vertebrates. But many species also had additional teeth on the palate, the roof of the mouth, and some of these palatal teeth were enormous, true fangs that could puncture and hold prey items that the marginal teeth alone could not secure. Imagine a mouth that worked like a trap within a trap, the outer ring of teeth seizing the prey and the inner fangs driving down into it, ensuring that nothing caught in that terrible gape could possibly wriggle free. This is the mouth of a Temnospondyl. This is the mouth of a creature that did not chase its food but waited for its food to come to it, and then made absolutely certain that the encounter ended in only one way. The limbs of Temnospondyls varied considerably across the group, and this variation tells us about the range of lifestyles these animals adopted. Some Temnospondyls had relatively robust limbs with well-developed digits, suggesting at least some capacity for walking on land. Others had reduced limbs, small and almost paddle-like, clearly adapted for a life spent predominantly or entirely in the water. Still others fell somewhere in between, with limbs that could support the body on land for short periods, but were primarily used for maneuvering in shallow water and across soft mud. What is most telling is that across the entire group, across all the hundreds of species and tens of millions of years that the Temnospondyls encompassed, the general trend was toward the water. Even the more terrestrial species tended to stay close to aquatic environments, and many lineages that started out with a greater capacity for land locomotion gradually became more aquatic over time. The water was where these animals were most effective. The water was where the food was, and the water, ultimately, was where the Temnospondyls built their empire. Let us now look more closely at the world they inhabited, because the story of the Temnospondyls cannot be separated from the story of their environment. The Carboniferous period, which lasted from roughly 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago, was a time of extraordinary biological productivity. The vast coal swamp forests we described earlier were the engines of an ecosystem of staggering richness. The warm, humid climate promoted plant growth on a scale that has rarely been equaled in Earth's history. The resulting accumulation of organic material supported complex food webs that began with the decomposers, the bacteria and fungi that broke down dead plant matter, and extended upward through invertebrates, through fish, through the early tetrapods, the four-limbed vertebrates that had crawled out of the water millions of years earlier and were now diversifying into a bewildering array of forms. The Temnospondyls were among the most prominent of these early tetrapods, but they were not the only ones. The Carboniferous landscape was shared with a variety of other four-limbed creatures, some of them closely related to the Temnospondyls, others belonging to entirely different lineages. There were the Lepispondyls, a diverse group of small to medium-sized animals with their own distinctive vertebral structure, many of them elongated and snake-like or salamander-like in appearance. There were the Anthracosaurs, a group that some paleontologists believe was more closely related to the lineage that would eventually give rise to reptiles and mammals. And there were the very earliest members of the amniote lineage, the ancestors of all modern reptiles, birds, and mammals, small, lizard-like creatures that were just beginning to develop the adaptations that would eventually allow them to break free of the water entirely. But in the Carboniferous, these early amniotes were small players, minor characters in a drama dominated by the water-dependent forms. The Temnospondyls in particular were the top predators in most freshwater ecosystems. They came in a remarkable range of sizes. Some were small, no larger than a modern salamander, occupying ecological niches equivalent to those filled today by newts and small frogs. Others were medium-sized, comparable in body mass to a modern large dog or small seal, hunting fish and smaller vertebrates in the rivers and pools. And some, the largest and most spectacular members of the group, were enormous, reaching lengths of several meters and masses that may have exceeded several hundred kilograms. These largest Temnospondyls were the undisputed apex predators of their world. Nothing in their environment could challenge them. Nothing could threaten an adult of these species. They occupied the same ecological position that large crocodilians occupy today, but they did so in a world that was, if anything, even more favorable to their lifestyle than the modern tropics are to crocodiles. The waterways were warmer. The waterways were more extensive. The waterways were more interconnected, providing a continuous habitat that allowed these animals to spread across enormous geographic ranges. And the competition from land-based predators was, in the Carboniferous, essentially non-existent. The land was a place to bask, perhaps to lay eggs, possibly to make short overland journeys between water bodies, occasionally, but it was not a place where anything could seriously challenge a large Temnospondyl. The water was their kingdom, and in the Carboniferous, the water was everywhere. Let us take a closer look at how these animals actually lived, how they hunted, how they survived, how they interacted with their environment on a day-to-day basis. Because the Temnospondyls were not simply large and dangerous. They were sophisticated predators with sensory capabilities and behavioral strategies that were remarkably well suited to their ecological role. The key to understanding Temnospondyl hunting behavior lies in a single organ system, the lateral line. If you have ever watched a fish in an aquarium and noticed the faint line running along its flank from head to tail, you have seen the external evidence of a lateral line system. This system consists of a series of specialized sensory cells called neuromasts, arranged in lines along the body and particularly concentrated on the head. Each neuromast contains tiny hair-like projections that are sensitive to minute changes in water pressure. When something moves in the water near a fish equipped with a lateral line system, the pressure waves created by that movement are detected by the neuromasts, allowing the fish to determine the direction, distance, and even the size of the object creating the disturbance, even in complete darkness, even in water so murky that vision is useless. The Temnospondyls had lateral line systems. We know this because the skull bones of many temnospondyl species bear distinctive grooves and channels that correspond exactly to the pathways followed by lateral line organs in modern fish and aquatic amphibians. These grooves are not ambiguous. They are clearly defined, often deep, and they follow consistent patterns across related species, indicating that the lateral line system was not a vestigial holdover from their fish ancestors, but an actively maintained and functionally important sensory apparatus. The Temnospondyls were using the same prey detection system that had evolved in fish hundreds of millions of years earlier, but they were using it in a new context, as air-breathing tetrapods lying in wait at the surface of the water. Think about what this means for their hunting strategy. A temnospondyl lying motionless in shallow water, its body half buried in mud, its eyes barely above the surface, is not simply waiting and hoping that something edible will wander by. It is actively sensing its environment through a sophisticated network of pressure detectors that cover its head and, in some species, extend along its body. It can feel the approach of a fish from meters away. It can detect the vibrations caused by an insect landing on the water's surface. It can sense the footsteps of a small terrestrial animal walking along the bank, and it can distinguish between these different signals, between the steady, rhythmic vibrations of a swimming fish and the irregular, impulsive splash of a struggling insect, between the approach of potential prey and the approach of something too large to eat. When the signal matches the profile of prey, when the temnospondyl's brain determines that the source of the vibration is within striking range and of appropriate size, the animal attacks. And the attack, when it comes, is devastating in its speed and simplicity. The temnospondyl opens its mouth, creating a sudden influx of water that draws the prey in. This is called suction feeding, and it is a technique still used by many aquatic predators today, from large catfish to certain species of turtles. But in the temnospondyls, the wide, flat skull created an especially effective suction mechanism. The rapid opening of that enormous gape displaced a volume of water sufficient to pull in prey from a considerable distance, and the array of teeth, both marginal and palatal, ensured that once the prey entered the mouth, it stayed there. The entire sequence, from the detection of the prey to the completion of the strike, could be measured in fractions of a second. The temnospondyl might have waited hours for this moment, lying in absolute stillness, conserving energy, its metabolism barely ticking over. But the strike itself was explosive, a burst of muscular power that transformed the animal from a seemingly inert log of flesh and bone into a killing machine of terrifying efficiency. This ambush strategy has several important advantages from an evolutionary perspective. First, it is energy efficient. The temnospondyl spends almost no energy while waiting. It does not need to patrol a territory or chase down prey or engage in the sustained, metabolically expensive activity that pursuit predators must undertake. It simply waits, and the energy cost of waiting, for a cold-blooded animal lying in warm water, is negligible. Second, the strategy minimizes the risk of injury. Every time a predator chases prey, it risks damage, a broken tooth, a strained muscle, a collision with an obstacle. The ambush predator takes none of these risks. It strikes from a position of perfect stability and perfect surprise, and if the strike fails, it simply resumes waiting, no worse off than before. Third, the strategy is scalable. It works for small temnospondyls feeding on insects and larvae, and it works for large temnospondyls feeding on fish and other vertebrates. The basic mechanism is the same regardless of size, only the scale of the prey changes. This combination of sensory sophistication, energy efficiency, and lethal precision made the temnospondyls extraordinarily successful predators. They were not the most active animals in their ecosystem. They were not the fastest or the most agile, but they did not need to be. They had found a strategy that worked, a strategy that was perfectly matched to their environment, and they refined and perfected that strategy over tens of millions of years. In the warm, shallow, murky waters of the Carboniferous and later the Permian, nothing could compete with them. They were the ultimate expression of the ambush predator, and their world was built for them. But the temnospondyls did not exist in isolation. They were part of an ecosystem, a community of organisms that interacted with each other in complex ways, competing for resources, preying upon each other, shaping each other's evolution through the relentless pressure of natural selection. To understand the Temnospondyls, we need to understand the world around them, the organisms they ate, the organisms that ate them in their youth, and the organisms that over time would eventually challenge their dominance. Let us begin with their prey. In the Carboniferous period, the primary prey of most Temnospondyls was almost certainly fish. The freshwater systems of the Carboniferous were rich in fish diversity, including several groups that have no modern representatives. There were acanthodians, small to medium-sized fish with distinctive spiny fins. There were paleoniscoids, ray-finned fish with thick, shiny scales that represented the ancestors of the enormously diverse group that includes most modern bony fish. There were lungfish, which are still with us today in a much reduced diversity, air-breathing fish that could survive in stagnant, oxygen-poor water. And there were freshwater sharks, yes, sharks, including some species that were exclusively freshwater inhabitants and that shared the swamps and rivers with the Temnospondyls. For smaller Temnospondyls, invertebrate prey was also important. The Carboniferous was a golden age for aquatic invertebrates. The waterways teemed with insects, many of them aquatic in their larval stages, as well as crustaceans, worms, mollusks, and a variety of other invertebrate groups. The smaller Temnospondyl species, particularly juveniles, would have fed extensively on these invertebrates, graduating to larger vertebrate prey as they grew. Some of the larger Temnospondyls may also have taken terrestrial prey that ventured too close to the water's edge. The coal swamp ecosystems supported a remarkable diversity of terrestrial invertebrates, including giant millipedes of the genus Arthropleura, which could reach lengths of over 2 meters, and giant insects like the dragonfly relative Meganeura, with a wingspan approaching 70 centimeters. Whether these terrestrial invertebrates formed a significant part of the Temnospondyl diet is difficult to determine from the fossil record, but it is certainly plausible that a large Temnospondyl lying in shallow water near the bank would not pass up the opportunity to seize a large millipede or other invertebrate that came within reach. In addition to invertebrates and fish, the larger Temnospondyls almost certainly preyed on other tetrapods, including smaller Temnospondyls. Cannibalism and intraguild predation, the consumption of other predators, are common in modern crocodilian populations, and there is no reason to think that Temnospondyls behaved differently. A large adult Temnospondyl would have been perfectly capable of seizing and consuming a juvenile or subadult of its own species, or a member of a smaller Temnospondyl species, or one of the many other small tetrapods that inhabited the same waterways. The fossil record provides some indirect evidence for this in the form of Temnospondyl bones found with bite marks consistent with the teeth of other Temnospondyls, and in the discovery of smaller tetrapod bones preserved within the body cavities of larger Temnospondyl specimens. Now let us consider the other side of the equation. What ate the Temnospondyls? For the largest adults of the biggest species, the answer is probably nothing. Like modern large crocodilians, the biggest Temnospondyls were almost certainly apex predators with no natural enemies in their adult state. But juveniles were a different matter. Young Temnospondyls, before they reached the size at which they became invulnerable, would have been prey for a variety of predators, including larger Temnospondyls, large predatory fish, and possibly some of the larger terrestrial predators that were beginning to appear in the Carboniferous. Among these terrestrial predators, one group deserves special attention because they would eventually play a crucial role in the Temnospondyl story. These were the early reptiles, or more precisely, the early amniotes, the first vertebrates to develop the ability to reproduce entirely on land without the need for an aquatic egg stage. In the Carboniferous, these animals were small, unassuming creatures, most of them no larger than a modern lizard. They were insectivores primarily, feeding on the abundant terrestrial invertebrate fauna of the coal swamps. They posed no threat to adult Temnospondyls and were, in fact, likely prey items for the larger species, but they possessed a set of adaptations that, over time, would prove to be profoundly important. The most significant of these adaptations was the amniotic egg. Unlike the eggs of Temnospondyls and other amphibians, which had to be laid in water or at least in very moist conditions, and which lacked a protective shell, the amniotic egg had multiple membrane layers that prevented desiccation and a shell, initially soft but eventually hardened in some lineages, that protected the developing embryo from physical damage. The amniotic egg freed its bearers from the need to return to water to reproduce. It allowed them to colonize habitats that were too dry for amphibian reproduction, to exploit resources that were inaccessible to water-dependent animals, and most importantly, to survive and even thrive during periods when the climate became drier and the great wetlands that supported the Temnospondyls began to shrink. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the Carboniferous, the amniotes were still minor players, and the Temnospondyls were the dominant large vertebrates in most freshwater ecosystems. Let us stay in the Carboniferous a while longer and examine some of the specific Temnospondyl groups that flourished during this period, because the diversity of forms within the Temnospondyl lineage is one of the most striking features of their long evolutionary history. One of the earliest and most important groups of Carboniferous Temnospondyls was the Oedipoidea. These were among the more primitive members of the Temnospondyl lineage, and they exhibit many of the features that we associate with the group as a whole, but in a form that is perhaps slightly less specialized, slightly less extreme than what we see in some of the later groups. The Oedipoids had wide, flat skulls, but the skulls were not as dramatically flattened as those of some later Temnospondyls. They had lateral line systems, indicating an aquatic or semi-aquatic lifestyle, but some species may have been more capable of terrestrial locomotion than their later relatives. One of the best-known Oedipoids is Oedips, the animal that gives the group its name. Oedips was a substantial animal, with a skull that could reach 40 centimeters in length, suggesting a total body length of perhaps 1.5 meters or more. It was a broad-headed predator with powerful jaws and large teeth, and it was clearly adapted for life in or near water. But its limbs were relatively robust, suggesting that it could move on land more effectively than many later Temnospondyls. Oedips may represent something close to the ancestral Temnospondyl condition, a large, powerful predator that was equally at home in shallow water and on the muddy banks of the Carboniferous waterways. Another important Carboniferous group was the Dendropetonidae, which included the well-known genus Dendropeton. This animal is particularly important in the history of paleontology because it was one of the first Temnospondyls to be discovered and described, found in the famous coal deposits of an area in the northern part of the Atlantic coast of the ancient Euramerican continent. Dendropeton was a medium-sized animal, probably around 1 meter in length, with a skull that was somewhat narrower than those of many later Temnospondyls. This has led some paleontologists to suggest that Dendropeton may have been somewhat more terrestrial in its habits than the classic Temnospondyl model would suggest, perhaps spending more time on land hunting for invertebrates and small vertebrates and returning to the water primarily to breed. But while these earlier groups are important for establishing the basic Temnospondyl body plan and showing the range of ecological strategies that the group could adopt, it is in the later Carboniferous and particularly in the Permian period that the Temnospondyls really come into their own. It is during this time that we see the evolution of the largest, most specialized, and most ecologically dominant Temnospondyl groups, the animals that would dominate freshwater ecosystems across the globe for tens of millions of years. The transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian period, roughly 299 million years ago, was marked by significant environmental changes that had profound effects on the Temnospondyl lineage and on the broader ecosystems in which they lived. The most important of these changes was a shift in climate from the warm, humid conditions that had characterized much of the Carboniferous to a progressively drier and more seasonal climate in the Permian. This shift was driven by a combination of factors, including changes in atmospheric composition, the continuing assembly of the supercontinent Pangaea, and the resulting alteration of ocean circulation patterns and rainfall distribution. The formation of Pangaea is one of the most important geological events of this entire time period, and its effects on life, including on the Temnospondyls, cannot be overstated. During the Carboniferous, the world's land masses were moving toward each other, converging through the process of plate tectonics into a single, enormous supercontinent. By the early Permian, this process was well advanced. The great southern continent of Gondwana, which included what would eventually become Africa, South America, India, Antarctica, and Australia, had collided with the northern continents of Laurentia and Baltica, creating a single land mass that stretched from pole to pole. The creation of Pangaea had several important effects on the global environment. First, it reduced the total length of coastline, because a single large continent has less coastline relative to its area than multiple smaller continents. This reduced the moderating influence of the ocean on the continental interior, leading to more extreme temperatures and more pronounced seasonal variations. Second, the collision of the continents created massive mountain ranges along the suture zones where the plates met, and these mountains altered atmospheric circulation patterns, creating rain shadows and dry zones in areas that had previously been well watered. Third, the sheer size of the continental interior meant that moisture-laden air from the oceans could not penetrate very far inland, creating vast arid regions in the center of Pangaea that were too dry to support the kind of lush wetland ecosystems that had characterized the Carboniferous. For the Temnospondyls, these changes were a double-edged sword. On one hand, the drying of the continental interior reduced the extent of the freshwater habitats on which they depended. The great coal swamp forests of the Carboniferous contracted, replaced in many areas by drier woodlands and eventually by semi-arid scrublands. The vast interconnected waterway systems that had provided the Temnospondyls with an essentially continuous habitat began to fragment, breaking up into isolated river systems, lakes, and ponds separated by increasingly large stretches of dry land. On the other hand, the freshwater habitats that remained were often highly productive, supporting dense populations of fish and invertebrates that provided abundant food for aquatic predators. And the Temnospondyls, with their energy-efficient ambush strategy and their ability to survive in a wide range of aquatic conditions, were well suited to exploit these remaining habitats. In many ways, the early Permian was the golden age of temnospondyl diversity, a time when the group radiated into an extraordinary variety of forms, filling virtually every available ecological niche in freshwater environments. Let us look at some of the most remarkable temnospondyl groups that appeared during this period. Among the most spectacular Permian temnospondyls were the Areopidae, named after the iconic genus Areops. If you have ever seen a reconstruction of a Permian temnospondyl in a museum or a textbook, there is a good chance it was Areops. This animal is one of the best known and most extensively studied of all temnospondyls, thanks to the discovery of numerous well-preserved specimens from the early Permian of what was then the equatorial region of western Pangaea. Areops was a big animal. Adults could reach lengths of 1.5 to 2 meters, with a skull that was broad, heavy, and powerfully built. The teeth were large and numerous, and the palatal fangs were especially impressive, long, curved, and clearly designed for seizing and holding large, struggling prey. The body was stocky and robust, with short but sturdy limbs that could support the animal's considerable weight on land. The tail was relatively short and deep, suitable for propulsion in water but not as elongated as the tails of more fully aquatic temnospondyls. Areops is interesting because it appears to have been one of the more terrestrial of the large temnospondyls. Its limbs were relatively well developed, and biomechanical analyses of its skeleton suggest that it was capable of walking on land with a gait somewhat similar to that of a modern large salamander, although undoubtedly slower and more labored. This does not mean that Areops was a land animal in the way that a modern lizard or crocodile is. It was still fundamentally tied to the water for hunting, for thermoregulation, for reproduction, and probably for avoiding desiccation. But it may have been capable of making longer overland journeys than many other temnospondyls, moving between water bodies as they shrank and shifted in the increasingly seasonal Permian climate. The diet of Areops has been the subject of considerable study and some debate. Its large size and powerful jaws suggest that it was capable of taking a wide range of prey, including large fish, other temnospondyls, and possibly even small reptiles and synapsids, the early mammal relatives that were becoming increasingly common in the Permian. Some researchers have suggested that Areops may have been capable of a feeding behavior similar to the death roll of modern crocodilians, using its powerful neck and body muscles to twist chunks of flesh from prey too large to swallow whole. This remains speculative, but the overall body plan of Areops is certainly consistent with such a behavior. While Areops was one of the most terrestrially capable of the large temnospondyls, other Permian groups were moving in the opposite direction, becoming increasingly aquatic and developing body plans that were even more specialized for life in the water. Among the most remarkable of these were the Archaegosauridae, a family of temnospondyls that appeared in the late Carboniferous and reached their greatest diversity in the early Permian. The Archaegosaurids were elongated, crocodile-like animals with long, narrow snouts, an unusual skull shape for temnospondyls, which more typically had broad, flat skulls. The narrow snout of the Archaegosaurids suggests a different hunting strategy from the typical temnospondyl ambush approach. Rather than waiting motionless and striking at passing prey with a wide gape, the Archaegosaurids may have been active fish hunters, using their narrow jaws to make quick, snapping grabs at fish in the manner of modern gharials, the long-snouted crocodilians of South Asia. Their bodies were elongated and their limbs were reduced, further suggesting a primarily aquatic lifestyle. The most famous archegosaurid is Archegosaurus itself, known from excellent specimens preserved in the early Permian deposits of what was then the tropical region of the Central European portion of Pangaea. Archegosaurus could reach lengths of about 1.5 meters, and its preservation is so good that paleontologists have been able to study not just its bones, but also the structure of its gills, providing direct evidence that at least some Temnospondyls retained external gills as adults, much like modern axolotls and other neotenic salamanders. This finding was significant because it confirmed that the relationship between Temnospondyls and water was not just a matter of habitat preference, but was, in at least some species, a fundamental physiological dependency. These animals could not leave the water because they breathed through it. Another remarkable group of Permian Temnospondyls was the Disaurophoidea, which took a very different evolutionary path from the Archegosaurids. While the Archegosaurids became more aquatic, the Disaurophoids became, at least in some lineages, more terrestrial. The Disaurophoids were mostly small to medium-sized animals, and some of them developed features that are quite unusual for Temnospondyls. Several Disaurophoid genera, for example, had bony armor plates or osteoderms embedded in their skin, forming a protective covering over the back and sometimes the belly. This armor is reminiscent of the bony scutes found in modern crocodilians and armadillos, and it presumably served the same function, protecting the animal from predators. The development of armor in Disaurophoids is telling because it suggests that these animals were spending enough time on land to be vulnerable to terrestrial predators. In the water, a Temnospondyl was relatively safe, protected by its aquatic environment and its ability to retreat into deeper water or under cover. On land, however, a Temnospondyl was much more vulnerable. It was slow, it was clumsy, and it was far from its element. Armor would have provided a crucial defense for an animal that was venturing onto land more frequently, perhaps to hunt for terrestrial invertebrates, perhaps to travel between water bodies, perhaps for reasons of thermoregulation. Some Disaurophoids went even further in their terrestrial adaptations. The amphibamids, a subgroup within the Disaurophoidea, were small, lightly built animals with relatively long legs and other features suggestive of a significantly terrestrial lifestyle. Some paleontologists believe that the amphibamids, or animals very closely related to them, may have been the ancestors of modern frogs, salamanders, and caecilians. If this is correct, then the Disaurophoids represent not just a fascinating side branch of Temnospondyl evolution, but the very root of the lineage that includes all modern amphibians. The frogs croaking in your garden, the salamanders hiding under logs in the forest, the strange, legless caecilians burrowing through the soil of tropical regions, all of them may trace their ancestry back to a group of small, armor-plated Temnospondyls that learned to live on land in the Permian period. As we survey the remarkable diversity of Permian Temnospondyls, it is important to step back and consider what was happening in the broader evolutionary picture. The Temnospondyls were not the only group of large vertebrates evolving and diversifying during this period. Alongside them, and in some cases in direct competition with them, were several other major lineages that would play crucial roles in the future of life on Earth. The most important of these were the synapsids, the group that includes all modern mammals and their extinct relatives. In the Permian, the synapsids were the dominant large animals on land, occupying ecological roles equivalent to those filled today by large herbivores and large terrestrial predators. Early synapsids like the sail-backed Dimetrodon, which is often mistakenly identified as a dinosaur but was actually more closely related to you and me than to any dinosaur, were the top predators in terrestrial ecosystems. Later synapsids, the therapsids, became even more diverse and successful, filling a wide range of ecological niches and evolving some remarkably mammal-like features, including evidence for warm-bloodedness, complex tooth differentiation, and possibly even fur. The synapsids and the Temnospondyls largely occupied different ecological zones and therefore did not compete directly with each other in most situations. The synapsids were primarily terrestrial, hunting and being hunted on land. The Temnospondyls were primarily aquatic, ruling the waterways and wetlands. The boundary between these two worlds, the water's edge, was a zone of interaction and occasional conflict, but for the most part the two groups coexisted, each dominating its own realm. But this arrangement was not static. As the Permian progressed and the climate continued to dry, the balance between aquatic and terrestrial environments shifted. The freshwater systems contracted, the land expanded. And the synapsids, with their terrestrial adaptations and their independence from water for reproduction, were increasingly favored by the changing conditions. The Temnospondyls were not declining in any absolute sense, not yet, but their share of the total vertebrate biomass was probably decreasing as the terrestrial component of the ecosystem grew at the expense of the aquatic component. At the same time, another group was quietly evolving in the shadow of the synapsids. The reptiles in the traditional sense of the word, the diapsids and other early reptilian lineages, were diversifying and exploring new ecological opportunities. These animals were generally smaller than the synapsids and could not compete with them for the top predator and large herbivore niches on land, but they were evolving a variety of interesting adaptations, some of which would prove to be extraordinarily important in the long run. Some were becoming specialized for life in trees. Others were experimenting with gliding flight. Still others were becoming adapted to arid environments, developing the water-conserving physiology that would serve their descendants so well in the dry conditions that lay ahead. The Permian world, then, was a world in transition. The old order in which the waterways and wetlands dominated the landscape and the Temnospondyls ruled those waterways was slowly giving way to a new order in which the land was becoming more important and the animals adapted to land. The synapsids and the early reptiles were gaining in prominence. But this transition was slow, playing out over tens of millions of years, and throughout the Permian, the Temnospondyls remained a major component of global vertebrate diversity. They were still abundant, still diverse, still ecologically dominant in their freshwater habitats. The future might belong to the land, but the present, for now, still belonged to the water. Let us pause here and consider a question that is fundamental to this entire story. How do we know any of this? How do we know what Temnospondyls looked like, how they hunted, what they ate, how they moved? How do we reconstruct the ecology and behavior of animals that have been dead for hundreds of millions of years, whose bodies have been transformed into stone, whose habitats have been buried under kilometers of younger rock? The answer, of course, is fossils. But that answer, while correct, is misleadingly simple. It suggests that paleontologists simply dig up complete skeletons, assemble them like puzzles, and describe what they see. The reality is vastly more complex, more uncertain, and more intellectually demanding than this popular image suggests. The vast majority of fossils discovered by paleontologists are not complete skeletons. They are fragments, a partial skull, a few vertebrae, a single limb bone, a scattered collection of teeth. The fossil record is, by its nature, profoundly incomplete. The conditions required for fossilization, rapid burial in sediment, the right chemical conditions for mineral replacement, protection from erosion and tectonic destruction over millions of years, are met only rarely. Most organisms that have ever lived have left no trace whatsoever in the fossil record. Those that have left traces have usually left only fragments, isolated bones or teeth that separated from the rest of the skeleton before or during burial, scattered by scavengers or water currents or the simple processes of decay. Working with these fragments requires a combination of deep anatomical knowledge, rigorous comparative methods, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. When a paleontologist discovers a partial temnospondyl skull, they must compare it to every other temnospondyl skull that has ever been described, looking for shared features that indicate evolutionary relationships and unique features that distinguish the new specimen from previously known species. They must assess the geological context of the find, determining the age and depositional environment of the sediments in which the fossil was found, which provides information about when and where the animal lived. They must look for associated fossils, other organisms preserved in the same deposit, which provide clues about the ecological community of which the animal was a part. And they must bring to bear the full toolkit of modern analytical techniques, from CT scanning to stable isotope analysis to computational biomechanics, to extract every possible piece of information from the available material. The interpretation of temnospondyl fossils has changed enormously over the more than century and a half since these animals were first recognized as a distinct group. Early paleontologists, working with limited material and even more limited comparative frameworks, often misidentified temnospondyl remains, confusing them with fish, with reptiles, or with other amphibians. The classification of temnospondyls has been repeatedly revised as new material has been discovered and new analytical methods have been applied. Relationships that seemed clear a generation ago have been overturned by new evidence. Species that were thought to be distinct have been combined. Species that were thought to be identical have been separated. The history of temnospondyle paleontology is a history of constant revision, constant reevaluation, constant refinement of our understanding. This process of revision is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of science working as it should. The fossil record does not provide answers, it provides evidence. And that evidence must be interpreted, and interpretations must be tested against new evidence as it becomes available. The picture of temnospondyle evolution that we have today is vastly more detailed, more nuanced, and more accurate than the picture we had 50 years ago, which was in turn vastly improved over the picture that existed a century before that. But there is still much that we do not know, much that we may never know, about these extraordinary animals. Every new fossil has the potential to change our understanding. Every new analytical technique has the potential to reveal information that was previously inaccessible. The story of the Temnospondyls is, in this sense, a story that is still being written. One of the most important things that the fossil record has revealed about Temnospondyls is the sheer geographic extent of their distribution. Temnospondyl fossils have been found on every continent, including Antarctica. This extraordinary geographic range reflects the fact that during the Carboniferous and Permian periods, the world's continents were joined together into the supercontinent Pangaea, allowing animals to disperse across enormous distances without having to cross oceanic barriers. But it also reflects the ecological versatility of the temnospondyls themselves. They were not confined to a single type of habitat or a single climatic zone. They occupied freshwater environments ranging from tropical swamps to temperate rivers to possibly subpolar lakes. They adapted to a wide range of conditions, and their fossils turn up in sedimentary rocks representing virtually every type of freshwater environment that existed during their reign. The discovery of temnospondyl fossils in Antarctica is particularly noteworthy. Today, Antarctica is a frozen, lifeless continent, covered by kilometers of ice and surrounded by frigid ocean. But during the Permian, Antarctica was part of the southern portion of Pangaea, positioned at a lower latitude than today and experiencing a much warmer climate. It was forested, it had rivers and lakes, and those rivers and lakes were home to temnospondyls. The fossils found in Antarctic rocks tell us that temnospondyls had spread to the very ends of the earth, colonizing freshwater habitats wherever they existed. There was, during the peak of their diversity, essentially no freshwater ecosystem on the planet that did not include temnospondyls among its inhabitants. Let us now focus on one of the most fascinating aspects of temnospondyl biology, an aspect that has been the subject of intense research and considerable debate among paleontologists. This is the question of temnospondyl reproduction and life history. How did these animals reproduce? How did they grow? How did they develop from hatchlings into the formidable predators that dominated Carboniferous and Permian waterways? These questions are difficult to answer because the fossil record rarely preserves the evidence needed to reconstruct reproductive biology directly. Soft tissues, including reproductive organs, almost never fossilize. Eggs, unless they are shelled and buried in appropriate conditions, are rarely preserved. The behaviors associated with reproduction, courtship, mating, parental care, leave no direct trace in the fossil record. Despite these limitations, paleontologists have been able to piece together a partial picture of temnospondyl reproduction through several lines of evidence. First, the study of modern amphibians, which are the closest living relatives of the temnospondyls, provides a baseline expectation for the general type of reproductive biology that temnospondyls may have employed. Modern amphibians, with a few exceptions, reproduce by external fertilization, with females laying eggs in water and males fertilizing them externally. The eggs develop into aquatic larvae, which then undergo metamorphosis to become adults. This is the basic amphibian reproductive pattern, and it is reasonable to assume that temnospondyls, as members of the broader amphibian lineage, employed some version of this pattern. Second, the fossil record provides some direct evidence for temnospondyl larval stages. Several temnospondyl species are known from specimens that represent clear juvenile and larval forms, small individuals with proportionally large heads, external gills, and incompletely ossified skeletons that are clearly not simply small adults but represent earlier developmental stages. The existence of these larval forms confirms that at least some temnospondyls underwent metamorphosis, developing from aquatic larvae into their adult form through a process of gradual transformation. The discovery of larval temnospondyl specimens has been particularly informative because it has allowed paleontologists to study the process of temnospondyl growth and development in detail. In several species, a growth series has been assembled, a sequence of specimens ranging from newly hatched larvae through various juvenile stages to full adults, that allows researchers to track the changes in body proportion, skull shape, tooth arrangement, and other features that occurred as the animal grew. These growth series have revealed that temnospondyle development was, in some species, remarkably different from the development of modern amphibians. In many modern amphibians, metamorphosis is a relatively abrupt process. A tadpole swims around for weeks or months, eating and growing, and then over a period of days or weeks, it undergoes a dramatic transformation, absorbing its tail, growing legs, reshaping its skull, and emerging as a miniature version of the adult. In temnospondyls, by contrast, the transformation from larva to adult appears to have been much more gradual in many species. The changes in skull shape, limb proportion, and body form that accompanied growth occurred slowly, over a prolonged period, without the sudden, dramatic metamorphosis seen in modern frogs and toads. This suggests that the temnospondyl developmental program was fundamentally different from the modern amphibian program, and it has led some researchers to question whether the term metamorphosis is even appropriate for the temnospondyl growth process. The implications of this extended growth period are significant. A temnospondyl that spent a prolonged juvenile phase in the water, gradually developing adult features over months or even years, would have occupied different ecological niches at different stages of its life. As a small larva, it would have fed on tiny invertebrates and organic particles in the water. As it grew, it would have gradually transitioned to larger prey items, competing with other juvenile temnospondyls and with other small aquatic predators. Only when it reached a certain size would it begin to occupy the top predator role that characterized the adult stage. This kind of ontogenetic niche shift, where an animal occupies different ecological roles at different stages of its life, is well known in modern animals, particularly in crocodilians and large fish, and it has important implications for the structure and dynamics of the ecosystems in which these animals lived. The question of parental care in temnospondyls is essentially unanswerable with current evidence. Some modern amphibians provide extensive parental care, guarding eggs, transporting larvae, and even feeding their young. Others provide no care at all, laying their eggs and leaving them to develop on their own. Without direct evidence, we cannot say which pattern the temnospondyls followed. However, the large body size and predatory lifestyle of many temnospondyl species might suggest that parental care was limited or absent in these forms, as is generally the case in large predatory amphibians and reptiles today. A female temnospondyl probably laid her eggs in a suitable aquatic location, a quiet backwater, a sheltered pool, a mass of vegetation, and then moved on, leaving the eggs and the resulting larvae to fend for themselves. The high reproductive output implied by external fertilization and the lack of shelled eggs would have compensated for the high mortality rate among unguarded offspring, as it does in modern amphibians and fish. As we move deeper into the Permian period, the temnospondyl story becomes increasingly intertwined with the story of global environmental change. The climatic trends that began in the late Carboniferous, the shift toward drier and more seasonal conditions, continued and intensified throughout the Permian, driving ongoing changes in the distribution and diversity of temnospondyls and the other organisms that shared their world. One of the most important developments of the mid to late Permian was the differentiation of temnospondyl faunas in different parts of the world. During the early Permian, the distribution of temnospondyls was relatively cosmopolitan, with similar species found across wide geographic areas. This was a consequence of the connectedness of the supercontinent Pangaea, which allowed animals to disperse freely across most of the world's land mass. But as the Permian progressed, climatic differentiation between different regions of Pangaea led to the development of distinct regional faunas, with different temnospondyl species and lineages dominating in different parts of the world. In the equatorial regions of Pangaea, where conditions remained relatively warm and wet, classic temnospondyl groups like the Eriopids and Archegosaurids continued to thrive. In the higher latitudes, particularly in the Gondwanan portions of the supercontinent, different temnospondyl lineages became prominent. The Rhynchochids, for example, were a group of large, broad-headed temnospondyls that became the dominant aquatic predators in the Permian waterways of southern Pangaea. These animals were superficially similar to the Eriopids of the equatorial region, but they belonged to a different evolutionary lineage and had their own distinctive features. Their success in the higher latitude portions of Gondwana suggests that temnospondyls were capable of adapting to a wider range of climatic conditions than was once thought, thriving not only in tropical swamps but also in temperate and even cool temperate freshwater environments. The differentiation of temnospondyle faunas across Pangaea is a reminder that the Permian world, despite being a single supercontinent, was not a single, uniform environment. Different regions had different climates, different vegetation, and different animal communities, and the temnospondyls adapted to this environmental diversity with characteristic versatility. They were not a single type of animal filling a single ecological niche. They were a diverse, adaptable lineage that could modify its basic body plan and ecological strategy to fit a wide range of conditions. But even as the temnospondyls continued to diversify and adapt, the larger trends of Permian climate change were moving inexorably against them. The continual drying of the continental interior, the shrinkage of freshwater habitats, and the increasing dominance of terrestrial ecosystems all worked to reduce the overall extent of the environments in which temnospondyls could thrive. The synapsids continued to diversify on land, producing an ever more complex array of herbivores and predators that dominated terrestrial food webs. And the early reptiles continued their quiet but significant evolutionary radiation, producing new lineages that would eventually, in the Mesozoic era, explode into the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, the marine reptiles, and all the other groups that we associate with the Age of Reptiles. The temnospondyls were still there, still abundant, still diverse, still ecologically important. But the world was changing around them, and the direction of change was not in their favor. The great wetland empires that had sustained their reign for over 100 million years were contracting, and the creatures that could live without the water, the synapsids, the reptiles, the early members of the lineage that would eventually give rise to the dinosaurs, were ascending. And then at the very end of the Permian period, roughly 252 million years ago, something happened, something catastrophic, something that would change the course of life on Earth forever, and that would mark the beginning of the end for the temnospondyls as a major force in global ecosystems. The Permian-Triassic mass extinction, often called the Great Dying, is the most severe extinction event in the entire history of life on Earth. It was more destructive than the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. It was more devastating than any other extinction event before or since. At its peak, it eliminated approximately 90 to 96% of all marine species, roughly 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species, and similar or even higher proportions of land plants, insects, and other groups. It came closer to sterilizing the planet than any other event in the past 500 million years. And it happened not in a single, sudden catastrophe, but over a period of perhaps 60,000 to several 100,000 years, a slow-motion apocalypse that ground down ecosystem after ecosystem until there was almost nothing left. The cause of the Permian-Triassic extinction is now well understood, at least in broad outline. The trigger was a series of massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia, producing what geologists call the Siberian Traps, one of the largest volcanic provinces on Earth. These eruptions were not like the eruptions of modern volcanoes. They were incomparably larger, producing flows of basaltic lava that covered an area of several million square kilometers to depths of hundreds or even thousands of meters. The eruptions continued intermittently for roughly 1 million years, pouring immense quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, and other gases into the atmosphere. The environmental consequences were devastating and cascading. The carbon dioxide released by the eruptions, augmented by additional carbon dioxide produced when the lava burned through coal and carbonate deposits in the Siberian crust, created a runaway greenhouse effect that raised global temperatures by an estimated 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. The oceans warmed, reducing their ability to hold dissolved oxygen. The increased temperature accelerated chemical weathering on land, stripping nutrients from the soil and washing them into the oceans, where they fueled massive blooms of algae and bacteria that consumed the remaining oxygen, creating vast dead zones. The sulfur dioxide produced by the eruptions combined with atmospheric moisture to create acid rain, which damaged vegetation and acidified freshwater systems. For the temnospondyls, the effects of the Permian-Triassic extinction would have been felt through multiple channels. The warming of freshwater systems would have disrupted the thermal regimes on which their cold-blooded physiology depended. The acidification of those systems would have damaged or destroyed the aquatic food webs that sustained them. The loss of vegetation along waterways would have increased erosion and sedimentation, filling in the quiet backwaters and pools where temnospondyls bred and hunted. And the general collapse of ecological productivity, both on land and in the water, would have reduced the prey base to levels that could not sustain large predator populations. The fossil record of the Permian-Triassic boundary tells a stark story. In many parts of the world, diverse Permian vertebrate communities containing multiple Temnospondyl species were replaced, across a few meters of geological strata representing a few thousand years of time, by communities containing a single Temnospondyl species or none at all. The larger, more specialized Temnospondyl lineages appear to have been hit hardest. The Areopids, the Archegosaurids, the Rhynchochids, all of these groups either disappeared entirely at the Permian-Triassic boundary or survived in greatly reduced diversity and abundance. But the Temnospondyls did not go extinct, not yet. Some lineages survived the Great Dying, emerging into the devastated world of the early Triassic as the battered remnants of a once mighty dynasty. And in the strange, emptied ecosystems of the post-extinction world, some of these survivors would experience a remarkable, if temporary, resurgence, growing to enormous sizes and filling ecological roles that had been vacated by the extinction of other groups. That resurgence and the final chapter of the Temnospondyl story will form the core of what we explore in the next part of this documentary. But before we reach that point, let us dwell a moment longer on the Permian world and on the animals whose fate was sealed by the fires of Siberia. Because the Temnospondyls of the late Permian deserve our attention not as precursors to what came next, but as remarkable organisms in their own right, products of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, perfectly adapted to a world that was about to be destroyed. Consider the sheer improbability of their success. The Temnospondyls arose at a time when the first vertebrates were just beginning to explore life on land. They evolved a body plan, a hunting strategy, a relationship with the aquatic environment that proved to be extraordinarily durable. They survived the initial colonization of land by vertebrates. They survived the diversification of the synapsids. They survived the evolution of the amniotes and the development of the amniotic egg. They survived the formation of Pangaea and the associated climate changes that eliminated the great Carboniferous coal swamps. They did not just survive these events, they thrived through them, diversifying into hundreds of species, spreading across every continent, and maintaining their position as the dominant predators in freshwater ecosystems for over 100 million years. 100 million years, let that number sink in. The entire age of dinosaurs, from the first dinosaurs in the late Triassic to the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous, lasted about 165 million years. The Temnospondyls as a group lasted even longer than that. The reign of the large, ecologically dominant Temnospondyls, from the late Carboniferous through the end of the Permian, lasted roughly 100 million years. And some Temnospondyl lineages would survive well into the Mesozoic, pushing the total duration of the group to over 200 million years. By any measure, the Temnospondyls were one of the most successful vertebrate lineages in the history of life on Earth, and yet they are almost unknown to the general public. Ask someone to name a prehistoric predator, and they will say Tyrannosaurus or Velociraptor, or perhaps a saber-toothed cat. They will not say Areops or Mastodonsaurus or Prehistoric. The Temnospondyls have been overshadowed by the dinosaurs in the public imagination, not because they were less successful or less interesting, but simply because the dinosaurs came later and in some cases were larger and more visually dramatic. The Temnospondyls suffered the evolutionary equivalent of being upstaged, overshadowed not by their superiors but by their successors. This documentary is in part an attempt to correct that oversight. The Temnospondyls deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be studied. They deserve to be recognized for what they were, one of the great dynasties of life on Earth, rulers of a world that existed long before the dinosaurs and that, in its own way, was every bit as complex, as dynamic, and as fascinating as the Mesozoic world that followed it. There is one more aspect of late Permian Temnospondyl biology that we should examine before we close this first part of our documentary, and that is the question of size. Because some of the Temnospondyls that lived during the Permian were not merely large, they were colossal. They were among the largest predators of any kind that had appeared on Earth up to that point, and their size tells us something important about the ecosystems they inhabited and the evolutionary pressures they experienced. The largest known Temnospondyl of the Permian period, and one of the largest Temnospondyls of all time, was Prehistoric, an animal known from the Middle to Late Permian of what was then the equatorial region of the southwestern portion of Pangaea. Prehistoric was a member of the Archegosauridae, the same family of elongated, crocodile-like Temnospondyls that we discussed earlier, but it took the Archegosaurid body plan to an extreme. Estimates of its total body length based on fragmentary but informative fossil material suggest that it may have reached lengths of up to 9 meters. 9 meters, that is nearly 30 feet, comparable in length to a modern saltwater crocodile and exceeding most crocodilians alive today. Pre-Dinosaur had a long, narrow snout filled with sharp, conical teeth, a body that was clearly adapted for a fully aquatic lifestyle, and a tail that was probably long and laterally compressed, suitable for propelling the animal through the water with powerful, undulating strokes. It was, in every sense, the top predator of its ecosystem. Nothing in its environment could have threatened an adult Pre-Dinosaur. It was the undisputed ruler of the freshwater systems in which it lived, a creature that occupied the same ecological niche that the largest modern crocodilians occupy today, but in a world where that niche was even more prominent and more productive than it is in the modern tropics. The existence of Pre-Dinosaur tells us several things about the Permian freshwater ecosystems. First, it tells us that these ecosystems were highly productive, capable of supporting a predator of enormous body mass. A 9-meter Temnospondyle would have required a substantial food supply, probably consisting largely of large fish and other aquatic vertebrates, and the fact that such a predator could exist implies that the food web beneath it was rich and deep. Second, it tells us that the Temnospondyls were not evolutionary dead ends, not feeble, transitional creatures struggling to keep up with the more advanced reptiles and synapsids. They were apex predators of the first rank, capable of reaching sizes that few vertebrate predators of any kind have ever achieved. Third, it tells us that the ambush predator strategy, the combination of stealth, patience, and explosive power that characterized the Temnospondyl approach to hunting, could be scaled up to enormous sizes without losing its effectiveness. A 9-meter Pre-Dinosaur lying motionless in a Permian river, waiting for a large fish to swim within range of its massive jaws, was using the same basic strategy as a 30-centimeter Temnospondyl larva waiting for a passing water beetle. The strategy worked at every scale, and it was this scalability, this fundamental versatility, that allowed the Temnospondyls to produce both tiny, salamander-like forms and monstrous, crocodilian apex predators from the same basic body plan. The story of Pre-Dinosaur also illustrates one of the great challenges of Temnospondyl paleontology. The animal is known from relatively limited fossil material, fragments of skull, vertebrae, and other skeletal elements that have been painstakingly collected and analyzed over decades. The size estimates, while based on sound comparative methods, are necessarily approximate. We do not have a complete skeleton of Pre-Dinosaur, and we may never have one. The animal lived in an environment, a tropical river system, where the conditions for fossilization were far from ideal. The soft sediments of river channels are constantly being reworked by water currents, breaking up and scattering the bones of animals that die in or near the water. The chances of a complete skeleton surviving this process and being preserved in recognizable form over 270 million years are vanishingly small. And yet from these fragments, from these scattered bones and teeth and vertebrae, paleontologists have been able to reconstruct not just the anatomy of Pre-Dinosaur, but something of its ecology, its behavior, its place in the world. They have been able to look at a few pieces of bone and see, in their mind's eye, a giant predator gliding through a warm Permian river, its lateral line system scanning the water for the telltale pressure signature of prey, its enormous jaws poised to deliver a strike of devastating power. This is the magic of paleontology. This is the process by which the deep past is made real, not through imagination alone, but through the disciplined application of scientific method to fragmentary evidence, building a picture that is always incomplete but always, with each new discovery, a little more detailed, a little more vivid, a little closer to the truth. We have now traveled from the steaming coal swamps of the Carboniferous, through the changing landscapes of the Permian, to the threshold of the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. We have met the Temnospondyls in their prime, watched them adapt and diversify across millions of years, and seen them rise to the pinnacle of freshwater predation. We have examined their anatomy, their sensory systems, their hunting strategies, and their reproductive biology. We have placed them in the context of the broader evolutionary story, noting the rise of the synapsids and the early reptiles as competitors and successors. And we have acknowledged the challenges and the rewards of the paleontological process that allows us to know anything about these remarkable animals at all. The Temnospondyls that stood at the edge of the Permian-Triassic extinction were the inheritors of over 100 million years of evolutionary success. They were diverse, abundant, ecologically important, and in the case of species like Prehistoric, truly awe-inspiring in their size and power. They had survived everything that the planet had thrown at them up to this point, adapting to changing climates, shifting continents, and evolving competitors with characteristic resilience. But the challenge that now faced them was unlike anything they had experienced before. The Siberian traps were erupting. The atmosphere was filling with carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. The oceans were warming and losing oxygen. The freshwater systems that had sustained the Temnospondyls for over 100 million years were being disrupted on a global scale. And the world that would emerge from this catastrophe, the strange, hot, oxygen-depleted world of the early Triassic, would be profoundly different from the one in which the Temnospondyls had evolved and thrived. Some of them would survive. Some lineages would make it through the bottleneck of the extinction and emerge, blinking, into the harsh light of the early Triassic. And in that devastated world, they would have one last chapter to write, one last episode of success before the rising tide of new competitors, the archosaurs and eventually the dinosaurs, finally swept them from the stage. That chapter, the final act of the Temnospondyls story, along with the rise of the archosaurs and the dawn of the Age of Dinosaurs, is where we will pick up when we return for part 2 of this documentary. We will witness the last giants among the Temnospondyls, creatures that grew to sizes rivaling their Permian ancestors in a world that was both emptier and more dangerous. We will see the first archosaurs, the ancestors of dinosaurs and crocodilians, begin their ascent to dominance, and we will trace the final, slow, inevitable decline of the Temnospondyl dynasty as the world they had known for over 100 million years finally, irrevocably, passed away. The story of the Temnospondyls is a story about time, about patience, about the power of adaptation and the limits of that power in the face of global catastrophe. It is a story about creatures that ruled a world we can barely imagine, a world of endless wetlands and dark waters and patient predators waiting in the shallows. And it is a story that, despite being 300 million years old, still has the power to reshape the way we think about life, about evolution, and about the deep, strange, magnificent history of this planet we call home. We will see you in part 2. Welcome back. In part 1, we traveled deep into the ancient world of the Carboniferous and Permian periods, meeting the Temnospondyls in their prime, understanding their anatomy, their hunting strategies, their sensory systems, and their extraordinary ecological dominance across the vast wetland empires of a world that no longer exists. We watched them diversify into hundreds of species across every continent, grow to enormous sizes, and establish themselves as some of the most successful predators in the history of vertebrate life. And we left them at the threshold of catastrophe as the Siberian traps began to erupt and the world that had sustained them for over 100 million years started to come apart at the seams. Now we return to complete the story. We will follow the Temnospondyls through the crucible of the Permian-Triassic extinction, witness their surprising resurgence in the devastated world that followed, and ultimately trace their long, slow decline as new predators, the archosaurs and eventually the dinosaurs, rose to fill the ecological roles that the Temnospondyls had once dominated. We will examine what the final Temnospondyl giants looked like, how they lived, and what their eventual disappearance tells us about the nature of evolutionary success and the relentless, impersonal forces of environmental change. And we will end by reflecting on what the Temnospondyl story means for our understanding of life on Earth, of deep time, of the way dynasties rise and fall across hundreds of millions of years. This is the final chapter of one of the longest and most remarkable stories in the history of life. Let us begin. The world that emerged from the Permian-Triassic extinction was, by any measure, a broken world. The catastrophic eruptions of the Siberian traps had injected so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that global temperatures had risen by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius above their already warm Permian baseline. The oceans had warmed to the point where deep water oxygen circulation was disrupted, creating vast anoxic dead zones that spread across the seafloor. Coral reefs, those crucibles of marine biodiversity, had almost entirely collapsed. The tropical ocean margins, once among the most productive ecosystems on Earth, had become hostile environments where high temperatures and low oxygen made life for most marine organisms impossible. On land, the situation was equally grim. The great Permian forests had burned or died back dramatically. Erosion, unchecked by vegetation, had stripped soil from hillsides and washed it into rivers, choking them with sediment. The rivers themselves had changed character, shifting from the meandering, stable, vegetation-bordered systems of the late Permian to braided, flashy, unstable streams that flooded episodically and then shrank to isolated pools between flood events. The steady, predictable waterway systems that had provided such ideal habitat for the Temnospondyls had been replaced by chaotic, unpredictable water bodies whose temperatures fluctuated wildly, whose oxygen levels were often dangerously low, and whose food webs had been shattered by the extinction of most of their constituent species. And yet, in this devastated world, life persisted. Not everywhere, not abundantly, not in anything approaching the diversity that had existed before the extinction, but in sheltered pockets in refugia where conditions were slightly less extreme, where food was slightly more available, where temperatures were slightly more tolerable, organisms survived. They were the inheritors of the post-extinction world, the lucky few that had made it through the bottleneck, and the story of the early Triassic is largely the story of these survivors and their struggle to rebuild ecological communities from the fragments of what had come before. Among those survivors were the Temnospondyls, not all of them, not most of them. The late Permian had hosted a diverse and abundant temnospondyl fauna, and the extinction had cut through that fauna with terrible efficiency. The great Euryopodids were gone. The Archaegosaurids, including the colossal Prionosuchus, had been eliminated. The Rhynchochids of southern Gondwana had been devastated. The specialized and beautifully adapted temnospondyl communities that had populated the world's freshwater systems for tens of millions of years had been reduced to a handful of surviving lineages, clinging to existence in whatever habitats remained habitable. But those survivors were tough, they were adaptable. And they were about to do something remarkable. The early Triassic period, roughly 252 to 247 million years ago, is one of the most unusual intervals in the entire history of vertebrate life. Because of the catastrophic extinction that preceded it, the early Triassic world was characterized by a phenomenon that paleontologists call low diversity, high abundance. What this means is that while the number of different species in any given ecosystem was dramatically reduced compared to the late Permian, the individual species that did survive often existed in enormous numbers, freed from the competitive constraints and predator pressure that had kept their populations in check before the extinction. In freshwater ecosystems, this pattern was particularly pronounced. The rich, diverse fish communities of the Permian had been severely depleted. The aquatic invertebrate communities had been devastated, but the freshwater systems themselves, though changed in character, still existed, still held water, still provided the basic habitat requirements for aquatic life. And into those impoverished but still functional waterways, the surviving Temnospondyls expanded with remarkable success. The most important temnospondyl group in the immediate aftermath of the extinction was the Stereospondyli, or Stereospondyls. This group had already been present in the late Permian, but it had not been the dominant temnospondyl lineage at that time, overshadowed by the Euryopodids and Archaegosaurids and other more prominent groups. The extinction changed all of that. The Stereospondyls turned out to be better equipped to survive the end Permian crisis than most other temnospondyl lineages, possibly because they were generally more fully aquatic and therefore less dependent on the specific terrestrial habitats that were so badly disrupted by the extinction. When the smoke cleared, figuratively speaking, the Stereospondyls were among the very few large vertebrate groups still present in significant numbers in freshwater environments, and they exploded in diversity and abundance to fill the ecological vacuum left by the extinction of so many other groups. The Stereospondyls had a distinctive body plan that was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of the temnospondyl design. They were almost completely aquatic, with reduced limbs that were more useful for maneuvering in shallow water than for walking on land, extremely broad and flat skulls with eyes positioned near the top, and bodies that were heavily built and clearly adapted for life in or near water. Their vertebrae were simplified compared to those of earlier temnospondyls, a derived feature that reflects the long evolutionary history of the group, but their overall body plan retained the essential characteristics that had made the temnospondyls such successful predators. They were ambush hunters, using their broad, flat skulls and wide gapes to seize prey with devastating suction-powered strikes. They had lateral line systems for detecting prey in murky water. And they were patient, energy-efficient predators that could survive on surprisingly little food during periods of ecological stress. The early Stereospondyls of the aftermath period were relatively modest in size compared to the giants of the late Permian. The ecological disruption of the extinction had probably reduced the productivity of freshwater systems to levels that could not sustain the truly enormous predators that had existed before. But the survivors were still substantial animals, some reaching lengths of 1 to 2 meters, and they were ecologically dominant in the freshwater environments of the early Triassic in a way that nothing else was. The synapsids, which had been so diverse and abundant in the late Permian, had been hit hard by the extinction and were only beginning to recover. The reptiles, also reduced in diversity, were similarly in the early stages of rebuilding. The Temnospondyls, specifically the Stereospondylus, were, for a brief but significant period in the earliest Triassic, the undisputed top vertebrate predators in freshwater ecosystems worldwide. Let us look more closely at some of the specific stereospondyl groups that characterized the early to middle Triassic recovery period, because the diversity of forms they produced during this time is extraordinary and tells us a great deal about the evolutionary flexibility of the temnospondyl body plan. One of the most important and widespread early Triassic temnospondyl groups was the Lidocurinidae. Lidocurinids were relatively small stereospondyls, generally less than a meter in length, with broad, flat skulls and the fully aquatic body plan typical of their subgroup. They have been found in early Triassic deposits across what was then Gondwana, including in what are now South Africa, India, and Antarctica. Their wide geographic distribution in the immediate aftermath of the Permian-Triassic extinction reflects both the connectivity of the Gondwanan portion of Pangaea and the ecological opportunity presented by the extinction of so many competing vertebrate groups. The Lidocurinids were not spectacular animals by temnospondyl standards. They were not the largest predators, not the most morphologically extreme, not the most behaviorally sophisticated. But they were resilient, adaptable, and apparently quite good at surviving in the degraded, disrupted freshwater ecosystems of the early Triassic. Far more impressive were the Trematosauridae, a group of stereospondyls that appeared in the early Triassic and diversified rapidly into a remarkable range of ecological forms. The Trematosaurids are notable for several reasons. First, they were among the first temnospondyls to develop truly elongated skulls, with long, narrow snouts similar to those seen in the Permian archegosaurids. This convergent evolution of the narrow-snouted skull shape suggests that it represents an effective adaptation for fish hunting in open water, and the Trematosaurids were almost certainly primarily piscivorous, pursuing and catching fish in rivers and lakes. But the most remarkable thing about the Trematosaurids was their apparent tolerance for, or even preference for, saline water. Fossil Trematosaurids have been found in deposits that represent not only freshwater environments but also estuarine and, in at least some cases, marine environments. Some Trematosaurid species appear to have been capable of crossing open sea, because their fossils have been found on continental blocks that were separated by shallow ocean basins during the early Triassic. This capacity for salt water tolerance is extraordinary for a group that was fundamentally an amphibian lineage. Modern amphibians are almost universally sensitive to salt water, which disrupts their water balance through osmosis and quickly kills them. The fact that some Trematosaurids appear to have been capable of tolerating saline conditions suggests that they had evolved physiological mechanisms for osmoregulation that were significantly more sophisticated than those of their modern amphibian relatives. The Trematosaurid capacity for marine or semi-marine existence opened up ecological opportunities that no previous temnospondyl had been able to exploit. By crossing the shallow seaways that divided portions of the Triassic world, Trematosaurids were able to colonize island landmasses and new continental areas, expanding the geographic range of the temnospondyls even beyond the extraordinary reach they had achieved during the Permian. In a world recovering from mass extinction, where many ecological niches were vacant and competition was reduced, this geographic expansion gave the Trematosaurids access to untapped resources and untapped evolutionary space. The Trematosaurids were also notable for producing some of the first temnospondyls to achieve truly large sizes in the post-extinction world. Trematosaurus itself, the type genus of the family, was a robust animal with a skull that could reach half a meter in length, suggesting a total body length of perhaps 2 meters or more. Other Trematosaurid genera were comparable in size. These were not the true giants that the Permian had produced, but they were substantial predators, fully capable of taking large fish and other aquatic vertebrates, and they represent the beginning of the trend toward increasing body size that would characterize some stereospondyl lineages throughout the Triassic. As the early Triassic gave way to the Middle Triassic, the world continued to recover from the devastation of the Permian extinction. Temperatures after the initial extreme warming of the post-extinction interval began to moderate slightly. Vegetation recovered and expanded, stabilizing soils and rebuilding the complex plant communities that formed the basis of terrestrial food webs. Fish diversity in freshwater and marine environments gradually increased. The synapsids began to diversify again, though they would never regain the dominance they had achieved in the late Permian. And the reptiles, particularly the archosaurs, began the diversification that would eventually lead to the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, and the crocodilians. In this recovering world, the Temnospondyls continued to thrive and diversify. Several new lineages appeared during the Middle Triassic, each exploring a somewhat different variation on the basic stereospondyl body plan. Among the most important of these was a group that would eventually produce some of the largest Temnospondyls that ever lived, animals that challenged, and in some cases surpassed even the enormous Pre-Dinosaurs of the Permian in sheer physical magnitude. These were the Capitosauria, the Capitosaurids and their relatives, a group of broad-headed, massively built stereospondyls that became the dominant large aquatic predators in many freshwater ecosystems of the Middle and Late Triassic. The Capitosaurids had taken the temnospondyl skull to its logical extreme. In the largest species, the skull was not merely wide and flat but truly enormous, a massive, heavily built structure that could reach over a meter in length and was proportionally much wider than it was deep. These were skulls designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to open wide enough and fast enough to engulf prey of substantial size, driven by the coordinated action of powerful muscles attached to the broad flanks of the skull and the robust lower jaw. The largest capitosaurid known, and one of the largest temnospondyls in the entire history of the group, was Mastodonsaurus, an animal that lived during the Middle to Late Triassic and whose remains have been found across what was then the central and western portion of Pangaea. Mastodonsaurus had a skull that in large individuals reached 1 meter in length, suggesting a total body length of perhaps 4 to 6 meters. It was a massively built animal, broad and heavy, clearly capable of very little in the way of terrestrial locomotion, but extraordinarily well adapted for life in large rivers, lakes, and swamps. Its teeth were impressive even by temnospondyl standards, with large marginal teeth and enormous palatal fangs that projected upward through notches in the upper jaw even when the mouth was closed, in the manner of some modern pit vipers. These protruding palatal fangs were among the most dramatic dental weapons in the temnospondyl lineage, and they almost certainly served to secure large, struggling prey that might otherwise be able to escape even after being seized. Mastodonsaurus was not alone among the giant capitosaurids. Several other genera of comparable or even greater size appeared during the Triassic, all sharing the basic body plan of enormous flattened skull, reduced limbs, and heavily built, fully aquatic body. These animals were the apex predators of Triassic freshwater ecosystems in much of the world, occupying the ecological role that the great Permian temnospondyls had held before the extinction. They were not the same animals as their Permian predecessors. They belonged to different lineages, had somewhat different anatomical details, and lived in a world that was ecologically and climatically different from the Permian world. But they filled essentially the same ecological role, the large, patient, ambush-hunting apex predator of freshwater systems, and they filled it with the same combination of anatomical precision and behavioral economy that had made the temnospondyl strategy so successful for so long. Another important capitosaurid, and one that deserves special mention for the remarkable quality of its fossil record, is Cyclodosaurus. This animal is known from numerous specimens from the late Triassic of what was then the Central European portion of Pangaea, and the quality of preservation in some of these specimens is extraordinary. Cyclodosaurus had a large, heavily built skull with distinctive circular orbital openings, the openings for the eyes that give the genus its name, from the Greek for circular ear. The skull shows the characteristic capitosaurid architecture in well-preserved detail, with broad, flat proportions, large palatal teeth, and the distinctive pattern of skull bones that defines the group. Studies of Cyclodosaurus specimens have provided important insights into capitosaurid growth patterns, sensory capabilities, and ecological relationships. The capitosaurids were not the only large stereospondyls of the Triassic. Alongside them, a variety of other lineages pursued their own ecological strategies. The Brachiopidae, or Brachiopids, were a group of short-snouted stereospondyls that appeared in the Triassic and would prove to be among the most long-lived of all temnospondyle lineages, persisting well into the Jurassic and possibly even into the early Cretaceous in some parts of the world. The brachiopods had shorter, more rounded skulls than the capitosaurids, and some species were considerably smaller, suggesting that they may have exploited somewhat different prey than their larger relatives. The Metaposauridae were another important Triassic stereospondyle group. Metaposaurids were large, broad-skulled animals with a distinctive feature that set them apart from most other temnospondyls. Their eyes were positioned unusually far forward on the skull, near the front of the head rather than toward the middle or back as in most other species. This forward eye position is puzzling, and paleontologists have proposed several explanations for it, none entirely satisfactory. One suggestion is that it reflects a bottom-feeding lifestyle, with the eyes positioned to look upward and forward as the animal lay on the bottom of a shallow water body. Another is that it is related to a specialized feeding behavior in which the animal struck at prey from below, using its upward-directed gaze to spot targets silhouetted against the lighter water surface above. Whatever the explanation for their unusual eye position, the metaposaurids were clearly successful animals. They are known from large accumulations of bones in some localities, suggesting that they aggregated in significant numbers, possibly congregating around shrinking water bodies during dry seasons in a manner similar to modern African lungfish or certain large amphibians. One famous metaposaurid bone bed, in what was then the equatorial region of the western portion of Pangaea, contains the remains of dozens of individuals of different ages and sizes, preserved together in a deposit that appears to represent a drying lake or river pool. This kind of mass mortality event, where many animals died together as a water body dried up, provides a poignant snapshot of the challenges that faced aquatic predators in the increasingly seasonal Triassic world. The picture of the Triassic temnospondyls that we have been building, these massive, flat-skulled apex predators ruling the rivers and lakes of the recovering world, is compelling, but it is incomplete if we focus only on the largest and most dramatic forms. The temnospondyl fauna of the Triassic was diverse, including not just the giant capitosaurids and metaposaurids, but also smaller, more ecologically specialized forms that occupied a variety of niches in freshwater ecosystems. Among the most interesting of these smaller Triassic temnospondyls were the plagiosaurids, a group so morphologically extreme that they initially puzzled paleontologists who encountered them. The plagiosaurids had skulls that were extraordinarily wide and flat, even by temnospondyl standards, combined with bodies that were short, broad, and heavily armored with osteoderms, bony plates embedded in the skin. Some species had skulls that were literally wider than they were long, giving the animal a bizarre, almost disc-like appearance when viewed from above. The eyes were small and positioned on the top of the skull, looking almost directly upward. What was a plagiosaurid? What was it doing with this extreme body plan? These are questions that have generated considerable debate. The most widely accepted interpretation is that plagiosaurids were highly specialized bottom dwellers, animals that lay on the floor of shallow, clear water bodies, with their enormous flat skulls pressed against the bottom, waiting for prey to pass overhead. The upward-directed eyes would have allowed them to spot passing fish or other aquatic animals against the lighter water above, and the wide skull with its large gape would have allowed them to engulf prey in an explosive upward lunge. The heavy body armor would have protected them from the attention of other predators while they lay motionless on the bottom. Some researchers have proposed an even more radical interpretation of plagiosaurid ecology. They suggest that these animals may have been filter feeders, using their wide skulls and specialized gill structures to strain small organisms from the water in the manner of whale sharks or basking sharks. This interpretation is based partly on features of the palate and gill region that seem inconsistent with a predatory lifestyle, and partly on the small size of the teeth in some plagiosaurid species. If the filter feeding hypothesis is correct, then the plagiosaurids represent the only temnospondyls known to have abandoned carnivory in favor of a gentler nutritional strategy, a remarkable deviation from the predatory lifestyle that characterized virtually every other member of the group. The debate over plagiosaurid ecology illustrates one of the central challenges of paleontology, the difficulty of inferring behavior and lifestyle from morphology alone. Bones can tell us a great deal about an animal's body plan and its functional capabilities, but they rarely tell us directly how the animal used those capabilities in life. The same morphological feature can sometimes be interpreted in multiple ways, and without additional evidence, such as stomach contents, trackways, or exceptionally preserved soft tissue, it can be impossible to determine definitively which interpretation is correct. The plagiosaurids have been scrutinized with every available analytical tool, from geometric morphometrics to computational fluid dynamics to comparative anatomy, and the debate over their lifestyle is still not fully resolved. What is clear, regardless of the specifics of their ecology, is that the plagiosaurids represent an extraordinary degree of morphological specialization. They had taken the basic temnospondyle body plan and pushed it to an extreme that was unlike anything else in the vertebrate world. In this sense, they are a perfect illustration of the evolutionary flexibility of the temnospondyle lineage, its ability to generate radically different body forms from a common ancestral blueprint through the sustained action of natural selection. As we move through the Triassic period, from the early to the middle to the late, the broader picture of vertebrate evolution is changing in ways that are profoundly relevant to the temnospondyle story. The archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to both the dinosaurs and the crocodilians, were diversifying rapidly and occupying an ever larger share of terrestrial and semi-aquatic ecological space. The early archosaurs of the early Triassic were relatively small and unspecialized, but by the middle Triassic, they had begun to produce a variety of larger, more ecologically important forms. Some were becoming large terrestrial predators, competing with the surviving synapsids for dominance on land. Others were exploring semi-aquatic lifestyles, beginning to invade the waterway margins that had long been the exclusive territory of the Temnospondyls. The relationship between the archosaurs and the Temnospondyls during the Triassic is a subject of considerable interest to paleontologists. For much of the Middle and Late Triassic, these two groups coexisted in the same ecosystems, sometimes occupying similar ecological roles. Large archosaurian predators like Postosuchus, a massive roysuchian that stood several meters tall and was one of the dominant terrestrial predators of the Late Triassic, hunted on land and probably along waterway margins. Large stereospondyls like Mastodonsaurus and the Metaposaurids dominated the water itself. The two groups occupied overlapping but distinct ecological zones, and the direct competition between them may have been limited by this partitioning of the habitat. But the archosaurs possessed a fundamental advantage over the Temnospondyls that would, over the course of the Triassic, prove decisive. That advantage was their reproductive independence from water. The archosaurs, as amniotes, laid shelled eggs that could be deposited on land and could develop in the absence of a standing body of water. This freed them from the constraint that bound the Temnospondyls to freshwater environments for reproduction. An archosaur could colonize any terrestrial habitat, regardless of how far it was from the nearest water body, as long as conditions for egg development, primarily appropriate temperature and moisture in the nest, were available. A temnospondyl, by contrast, was dependent on water for reproduction and could not successfully colonize areas that lacked suitable aquatic breeding sites. This reproductive difference had cascading consequences. As the Triassic climate became more seasonal and more arid in many parts of Pangaea, the distribution of permanent freshwater became increasingly patchy and unpredictable. The archosaurs, unconstrained by reproductive water dependence, could exploit terrestrial habitats across vast areas that were inaccessible to temnospondyls. They could maintain population connectivity across landscapes where the freshwater patches were too small or too ephemeral to support stable temnospondyl populations, and they could respond to environmental changes by moving and adapting without being anchored to a shrinking and fragmented network of aquatic habitats. The temnospondyls, for their part, were doing what they had always done. They were staying in the water, hunting from ambush, producing offspring that required an aquatic larval stage, and waiting out the difficult times by reducing their activity and their metabolic rate. This strategy had served them magnificently for over 100 million years, but it was a strategy that depended on the continued existence of suitable aquatic habitats, and those habitats, as the Triassic progressed, were becoming less and less reliable. There is another dimension to the competition between archosaurs and temnospondyls that we should examine, one that operates not at the level of individual organisms competing for food or space, but at the level of evolutionary lineages competing for ecological opportunity. This dimension is the question of metabolism. The temnospondyls, like all amphibians, were ectothermic or cold-blooded. Their body temperature was determined primarily by the temperature of their environment rather than by internal heat generation. This has important implications for their activity levels, their feeding rates, their growth rates, and their overall ecological impact. A cold-blooded animal is, in general, far less energetically demanding than a warm-blooded one of comparable size. It requires far less food to maintain itself. It can survive extended periods of food deprivation that would kill a warm-blooded animal of similar size, and it can afford to be much less active, much more patient in its approach to energy acquisition. These are all advantages in an environment where food is scarce or unpredictable, but ectothermy also has significant disadvantages. The activity level of an ectotherm is strongly temperature-dependent. At low temperatures, most ectotherms become sluggish, their metabolic reactions slow, their muscles unresponsive, their senses dulled. They cannot maintain sustained activity over long periods in the way that warm-blooded animals can. They cannot generate heat internally to maintain a stable body temperature in cold environments, and they cannot be active at night or in cold weather in the way that endothermic animals can. The archosaurs, and particularly the theropod dinosaurs that arose from within the archosaur lineage during the late Triassic, appear to have been evolving toward endothermy, or warm-bloodedness, during this period. The evidence for theropod endothermy is extensive and comes from multiple sources, including bone microstructure, body size trends, insulating features like feathers in later theropods, and the physiological requirements implied by their active pursuit-hunting lifestyle. If the early archosaurs and their dinosaurian descendants were indeed significantly more endothermic than the Temnospondyls, this would have given them important competitive advantages in environments where temperatures were variable or where sustained, energetically demanding activities like active pursuit hunting were essential for obtaining food. The contrast between the patient, energy-efficient, ambush-hunting Temnospondyls and the active, energetically demanding, pursuit-hunting archosaurs is not simply a contrast between two individual animals. It is a contrast between two fundamentally different approaches to the problem of being a large predator. The Temnospondyl approach, optimize energy efficiency, minimize activity, exploit prey that comes within range, had been spectacularly successful in a world where food was abundant and the aquatic habitat was stable and extensive. The archosaur approach, maintain high activity levels, actively pursue prey over large areas, exploit prey in diverse habitats, was more energetically demanding but also more flexible, more capable of adapting to a wide range of environmental conditions. As the Triassic world became more seasonal, more variable, and more ecologically complex, the archosaur approach proved increasingly advantageous. The ability to hunt actively in a variety of weather conditions, to pursue prey across diverse habitats, to maintain a constant body temperature regardless of the external environment, gave the archosaurs and their dinosaurian descendants a range of ecological opportunities that were simply not available to the Temnospondyls. And as the Triassic progressed into the late Triassic, the dinosaurs began to diversify rapidly and to occupy ecological roles across the full spectrum of terrestrial and semi-terrestrial environments. The late Triassic, roughly 235 to 201 million years ago, was a pivotal time in the history of life on Earth. It was the period during which the dinosaurs made their first appearance, as a relatively minor component of terrestrial ecosystems that were still dominated by non-dinosaurian archosaurs and surviving synapsids. It was the period during which the first pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that would rule the Mesozoic skies, took to the air. And it was the period during which the Temnospondyl lineage, though still present and still ecologically important in freshwater environments, began to show unmistakable signs of decline. The signs of that decline are visible in the fossil record as a general decrease in Temnospondyl diversity through the late Triassic. In the early and middle Triassic, Temnospondyl communities had typically included multiple species from several different families, reflecting the ecological diversity and adaptive range of the group. In the late Triassic, the picture became simpler. Fewer families were present, fewer species were represented in any given deposit. The ecological roles filled by Temnospondyls were becoming more restricted, increasingly limited to the fully aquatic ambush predator niche in large rivers and lakes. The semi-terrestrial and ecologically versatile Temnospondyls that had diversified so impressively in the Permian and early Triassic were largely gone. This narrowing of Temnospondyl ecological range reflects the increasing competitive pressure from the archosaurs. As the archosaurs diversified and occupied more and more of the available ecological space, they pushed the Temnospondyls out of the marginal habitats, the shallow waterway edges, the temporary pools, the floodplain environments where many Temnospondyl species had previously been able to make their living. The only Temnospondyls that could successfully resist this pressure were those that stayed firmly in the deep water, the large rivers and permanent lakes where their ambush hunting strategy remained effective and where the archosaurs could not yet follow them. The metaposaurids, in particular, held on into the late Triassic as significant predators in large river systems. Their fossils are found in considerable abundance in some late Triassic deposits, indicating that they remained ecologically important until relatively late in the period. The Capitosaurids also persisted, with several genera known from late Triassic deposits across the world. These animals were in many ways the last great Temnospondyl predators, the final representatives of the dynasty that had dominated freshwater ecosystems since the Carboniferous. And then at the end of the Triassic, something happened again. Another mass extinction event struck the planet, smaller than the Permian catastrophe but still significant, eliminating perhaps 45 to 50% of all species. The end Triassic extinction caused by another massive volcanic event, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, struck the remaining Temnospondyl diversity hard. The metaposaurids appear to have been eliminated entirely. The Capitosaurids were devastated. After 250 million years of existence, after surviving the Permian extinction and rebuilding from its aftermath, the great Temnospondyl predators were finally, irrevocably, gone from the dominant position they had held for so long. Or almost gone, because here is one of the most remarkable facts in the entire Temnospondyl story. Not all Temnospondyls disappeared at the end of the Triassic. Some survived. Some lineages made it through the end Triassic extinction, just as some had made it through the end Permian extinction before it, and entered the Jurassic period with, at least in some parts of the world, a continuing ecological presence. The survivors were primarily the brachiopods, those short-snouted, relatively small stereospondyls that had first appeared in the Triassic and had proved to be among the more resilient of the Temnospondyl lineages. Brachiopod fossils have been found in Jurassic deposits in several parts of the world, including in what are now Australia and Central Asia. In these areas, at least, freshwater ecosystems continued to support Temnospondyl populations well into the Jurassic period, long after the dinosaurs had established their dominance over terrestrial ecosystems. In some parts of the world, the Temnospondyl survival was extended even further. There is evidence, though it is fragmentary and contested, that some Temnospondyl lineages may have persisted into the Cretaceous period in isolated refugia, particularly in parts of what had been Gondwana. Australia, in particular, has yielded Temnospondyl fossils from deposits that may be as young as 110 million years old, deep into the Cretaceous, a time when the dinosaurs had long since established their dominance, and the world had taken on something much closer to its modern ecological configuration. If these Cretaceous records are accurate, then the last Temnospondyls survived for more than 100 million years after the end of the Triassic, persisting as relic populations in isolated freshwater environments long after the great days of their lineage had passed. They would have been the living fossils of their age, relics of a world that no longer existed, surviving in protected pockets of habitat while the world around them changed beyond recognition. The last Temnospondyls may have shared a world with ankylosaurs and hadrosaurs, and perhaps even with the early relatives of modern birds, animals that would have been as alien to them as a Temnospondyl would be to us. This persistence tells us something important about the resilience of the Temnospondyl lineage. They were not simply swept away by the dinosaurs. They did not collapse at the first sign of competition from more advanced vertebrates. They hung on in their freshwater refuges for as long as conditions permitted. The final extinction of the Temnospondyls was not a single catastrophic event, but a long, slow, attritional process. A gradual reduction in range and diversity over tens of millions of years as their habitat was progressively reduced and their remaining ecological niches were filled by other groups, particularly by the crocodilians, the archosaur lineage that had converged on the same semi-aquatic ambush predator lifestyle that the Temnospondyls had pioneered. The crocodilians deserve special attention in the Temnospondyl story because they are the most striking example of the evolutionary convergence between the Temnospondyl body plan and the archosaur lineage. Modern crocodilians, the crocodiles, alligators, gharials, and their relatives, are in many ways the ecological successors of the Temnospondyls. They are semi-aquatic ambush predators with broad, flat heads, eyes positioned on the top of the skull, powerful jaws, and an energy-efficient, patient hunting strategy that relies on waiting for prey to come within range rather than pursuing it across long distances. This similarity is not coincidental. It is the result of natural selection operating in the same environmental context, the freshwater ambush predator niche, over an extended period of time, producing similar solutions to the same ecological problem. The Temnospondyls and the crocodilians are not closely related. They belong to entirely different branches of the vertebrate family tree, but they evolved remarkably similar body plans because they were adapting to the same ecological role in the same type of environment. This phenomenon, where unrelated organisms independently evolve similar features in response to similar selective pressures, is called convergent evolution, and the similarity between Temnospondyls and crocodilians is one of the most striking examples of it in vertebrate paleontology. The rise of the crocodilians during the Triassic and their diversification through the Jurassic and Cretaceous had a direct impact on the surviving Temnospondyls. As crocodilians became more diverse and more abundant in freshwater environments, they competed directly with the remaining Temnospondyl species for the same prey and the same habitat. The crocodilians had several advantages in this competition. As amniotes, they were independent of water for reproduction. Their physiological capabilities, though they were themselves ectothermic, included certain advantages in water and ion regulation compared to amphibians. And their skulls, while less dramatically flattened than those of the most extreme Temnospondyls, were extremely powerful and versatile hunting tools. In some ways, the replacement of Temnospondyls by crocodilians in freshwater ambush predator roles represents one of the smoothest ecological transitions in the history of vertebrate life. One group of flat-headed, semi-aquatic ambush predators gradually gave way to another group of flat-headed, semi-aquatic ambush predators, with the transition occurring so slowly and so smoothly over tens of millions of years that the ecosystem itself was barely disrupted. The ecological role continued, only the tenant changed. Now let us turn to a question that goes beyond the specifics of temnospondyl biology and ecology, and addresses the larger significance of the temnospondyl story for our understanding of evolution in deep time. Why do we care about the temnospondyls? What does their history tell us that we could not learn from studying more familiar groups? The answer is several things, each of which challenges assumptions that are deeply embedded in popular thinking about evolution and prehistoric life. The first thing the temnospondyl story tells us is that evolutionary success is contextual. The temnospondyls were enormously successful for over 200 million years, dominating freshwater ecosystems across the globe, but that success was fundamentally dependent on the existence of the aquatic environments in which they thrived. When those environments changed, when the great wetlands contracted and fragmented and the climate became more arid and seasonal, the temnospondyls could not simply reinvent themselves. Their body plan, so brilliantly optimized for aquatic ambush predation, was not easily adaptable to the new ecological conditions. They could adjust at the margins, becoming somewhat more or less aquatic, somewhat larger or smaller, somewhat more or less specialized in their diet. But the fundamental strategy, water-dependent ambush hunting, could not be abandoned without essentially ceasing to be a temnospondyl. This is a cautionary tale about the nature of evolutionary specialization. Every adaptation is a trade-off. Every feature that makes an organism better at one thing makes it, at least potentially, worse at something else. The temnospondyl skull, so perfectly designed for suction feeding in shallow water, was useless for processing dry terrestrial prey. The temnospondyl dependence on water for reproduction, so effective in a world covered in freshwater, was a fatal vulnerability when that world dried out. The temnospondyl metabolic strategy, so energy efficient in a warm, stable aquatic environment, was a disadvantage in a world where high activity levels and temperature independence were becoming increasingly valuable. The success of the temnospondyls was real, and it was spectacular. But it was success in a specific context, and when that context changed, the success became a liability. The very features that had made them so dominant in the Carboniferous and Permian were the features that constrained their ability to respond to the challenges of the later Triassic and Jurassic. This pattern of a successful lineage becoming so specialized for a particular set of conditions that it cannot adapt when those conditions change is one of the recurring themes in the history of life, and the temnospondyls illustrate it with unusual clarity. The second thing the temnospondyl story tells us is about the relationship between extinction and opportunity. The Permian-Triassic mass extinction was the most devastating event in the history of animal life. It destroyed over 90% of marine species and perhaps 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. It came very close to erasing the entire complex ecological architecture that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build. And yet, from the paleontologist's perspective, the extinction also created something. It created ecological opportunity on a scale that had never existed before, and that would not exist again until the next mass extinction. The Stereospondylus that survived the Permian extinction found themselves in a world that had been emptied of competition. The great Permian predators that might have limited their population growth and constrained their ecological expansion were gone. The fish communities that had provided food but also competition were depleted. The plant communities that had structured the freshwater habitats were recovering slowly, leaving those habitats open for colonization by opportunistic aquatic predators. And the surviving Stereospondylus responded to this opportunity with remarkable evolutionary speed, diversifying from a handful of surviving lineages into a broad range of ecological forms within a geologically short time. This pattern, where mass extinction creates evolutionary opportunity for the survivors, is well documented in the fossil record. The most familiar example is the diversification of mammals after the end Cretaceous extinction that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs. But the Temnospondyl response to the Permian extinction is an equally striking example, perhaps even more so because the extinction was more severe and the recovery of the Temnospondyls was correspondingly more dramatic. The early Triassic stereospondyl fauna represents one of the most rapid recoveries of large vertebrate diversity following a mass extinction event that has been documented in the fossil record. This tells us something important about the resilience of life, not the resilience of individual organisms or individual species, but the resilience of the ecological roles themselves. The freshwater ambush predator niche did not disappear with the Permian extinction. It persisted empty and waiting until organisms capable of filling it had recovered sufficiently to do so. And when the surviving Stereospondylus began to fill that niche, they did so with evolutionary enthusiasm, diversifying rapidly into a variety of forms that between them covered most of the ecological space that the great Permian Temnospondyls had occupied. The third thing the Temnospondyl story tells us is about the nature of deep time and the limitations of human intuition in grasping it. 200 million years, 300 million years. These are numbers that we can write and say and manipulate mathematically, but that we cannot truly comprehend intuitively. Our intuition for time is built around the scale of human experience, of decades and centuries, and at the outside, the few thousand years of written history. We simply do not have the cognitive machinery to directly grasp what it means for a lineage to persist for 200 million years, but the Temnospondyl story gives us some concrete reference for these abstract numbers. The Temnospondyls were already ancient organisms, already a lineage with tens of millions of years of history behind it when the first dinosaurs appeared. They had lived through entire eons of Earth history, survived multiple mass extinctions, watched continents drift and collide and drift apart again before the first recognizable dinosaur drew its first breath. And they survived the arrival of the dinosaurs by many millions of years, persisting as relic populations in refugia long after the dinosaurs had established their global dominance. The Temnospondyls' relationship with the dinosaurs was not that of contemporaries or competitors, but more like the relationship between an ancient, established empire in slow decline and a vigorous new civilization on the rise. They overlap, but they belong to different worlds. Understanding this perspective, grasping even a fraction of what it means for life to have played out over these enormous timescales, is one of the most important things that paleontology can give us. It provides a corrective to the human tendency to think of the present as the endpoint of history, to assume that the current configuration of life on Earth is somehow the intended outcome of all the evolutionary events that preceded it. The Temnospondyls are a reminder that the present is not an endpoint but a moment in an ongoing process, that the organisms we see around us today are not the permanent residents of the planet but temporary occupants, no more permanent than the Temnospondyls were, no more immune to extinction and replacement than any other lineage in the 4-billion-year history of life. Let us return now to the physical world of the late surviving Temnospondyls, the animals that persisted into the Jurassic and possibly the Cretaceous, to get a sense of what their lives were like in the new world dominated by dinosaurs and archosaurs. Imagine a large freshwater lake somewhere in what was then the southern portion of Pangaea, now slowly breaking apart into the continents we recognize. The time is the Middle Jurassic, perhaps 170 million years ago. The landscape around the lake is very different from the coal swamp world of the Carboniferous. There are no lycopsid forests, no giant horsetails, no primitive fern understories. Instead, there are conifer forests, cycads with their palm-like fronds, ferns of a more modern type, and the first flowering plants just beginning to appear at the margins of ecosystems. The air is warm, but not as oxygen-rich as the Carboniferous air. The humidity is lower. The climate is more seasonal. Around the lake there are dinosaurs. Sauropods, long-necked and enormous, wade into the shallows to drink or to browse on aquatic vegetation. Ornithischians, early relatives of the later hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, graze along the lake margins. In the forest, theropods of various sizes hunt, their warm-blooded physiology allowing them to remain active through the cool of the night. And overhead, pterosaurs soar on broad wings, their sharp eyes scanning the water surface below for fish and other prey. But at the margins of the lake, in the shallow, weedy bays where the water is warm and murky and the bottom is soft, there is something else, something old, something that has been here or something very like it since before the dinosaurs' ancestors walked the earth. A broad, flat shape lies barely submerged near the waterline, motionless, indistinguishable from a waterlogged log. Its eyes, positioned on the top of its wide skull, barely break the surface. Its lateral line organs are scanning the water for the vibrations that signal the approach of prey. It is a brachiopid, one of the last Temnospondyls, a living remnant of a lineage that once dominated the world. It is smaller than its Permian or early Triassic ancestors. It is less diverse, less geographically widespread. It occupies a smaller ecological space than the great Temnospondyl dynasties of the past, but it is here, it is alive. It is functioning, hunting, reproducing, filling its ecological niche with the same combination of patience and precision and anatomical elegance that has characterized its lineage for over 200 million years. Around it, the world has changed almost beyond recognition. The plants are different, the sky-born animals are different, the land is different. But the warm, shallow water at the lake margin is essentially the same as it has always been, warm and murky and full of fish and invertebrates, and the animal lying in that water is doing essentially the same thing that its ancestors have always done. There is something both humbling and inspiring about this image. The Temnospondyl, this last representative of an ancient dynasty, surrounded by the representatives of a new world order that it never fully adapted to, continuing to do what its lineage has always done in the one place where it still works. It is not a failure. It is not a primitive holdover, inferior to the dinosaurs around it. It is a specialist, an organism so perfectly adapted to its particular niche that it has survived multiple extinction events, the rise and fall of multiple other dynasties, the transformation of the world's landscapes and climates and ecosystems, by simply continuing to do what it does best in the places where that strategy still works. The eventual extinction of the last Temnospondyls remains, in some respects, uncertain. As we mentioned earlier, the evidence for Temnospondyl survival into the Cretaceous is fragmentary and contested. The brachiopid fossils from Australia that may represent Cretaceous survivors are known from limited material, and their dating has been disputed. It is possible that the last Temnospondyls disappeared at the end of the Jurassic, or in the early Cretaceous, or in the late Cretaceous. We do not know for certain. What we do know is that by the time of the Cretaceous, the Temnospondyls, wherever they still existed, were restricted to small, isolated populations in specific freshwater environments. The crocodilians had taken over the freshwater ambush predator role across most of the world. The dinosaurs dominated the terrestrial and semi-terrestrial habitats. The pterosaurs filled the aerial niche. And the marine environments, which had never been a major habitat for Temnospondyls, were occupied by an extraordinary diversity of marine reptiles. There was simply very little ecological space left for the Temnospondyls. The disappearance of the last Temnospondyls was almost certainly not a dramatic extinction event, but a gradual fading away, a quiet end to a long story. Individual populations, already small and isolated, dwindled as suitable habitat contracted and as the predation pressure from crocodilians and other competitors increased. Breeding success may have declined as water bodies became less suitable, either too cold, too warm, too seasonal, or too occupied by competitors. One by one, the remaining populations fell below the threshold of viability and winked out, until the last Temnospondyl of all died, somewhere in a Jurassic or Cretaceous freshwater system, without any witness and without any fanfare. And then they were gone. After 200 million years, after surviving two mass extinctions, after outlasting the Carboniferous coal swamps and the Permian wetland empires and the early Triassic devastation, after witnessing the rise of the synapsids and the archosaurs and the dinosaurs, the Temnospondyls were finally completely gone. The freshwater ambush predator niche that they had pioneered was filled by the crocodilians. Their evolutionary legacy was carried forward in a modified form by the modern amphibians that almost certainly descended from within the temnospondyl lineage. And their physical remains were slowly buried deeper and deeper under accumulating sediment, compressed and mineralized, waiting for curious creatures from a distant future to find them and begin asking questions about what they were and how they lived. The process by which we have recovered the temnospondyl story from the fossil record is itself a story worth telling, a story of intellectual achievement and human curiosity and the painstaking, sometimes frustrating, sometimes exhilarating work of scientific discovery. The first temnospondyl fossils were described by scientists in the 19th century, during the great explosion of paleontological discovery that followed the development of geology as a scientific discipline. Early workers, confronted with the strange bones and skulls emerging from Carboniferous and Permian deposits, struggled to make sense of what they had found. The creatures were clearly vertebrates, clearly large, clearly not fish, but they did not fit neatly into any of the established categories of vertebrate life. Some early researchers classified them with reptiles, others saw affinities with fish. The realization that they represented a distinct group of early tetrapods, ancestral amphibians in a broad sense, came gradually through the work of multiple researchers over decades. The naming of the group Temnospondyli, formalized in the late 19th century, was an important step in organizing the growing collection of specimens into a coherent taxonomic framework, but naming a group is only the beginning of understanding it. The decades that followed the formal naming of the Temnospondyls saw an enormous expansion in the number of known species, as fossils were collected from an ever wider range of localities and geological periods. By the mid-20th century, hundreds of temnospondyl species had been described, from deposits on every continent, spanning the entire interval from the Carboniferous to the Jurassic. The sheer volume of material made synthesis difficult. Different workers classified the same animals differently, used different characters to define groups and relationships, and reached different conclusions about the evolutionary history of the lineage. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen a transformation in our understanding of temnospondyl evolution, driven by several developments. The application of cladistic methods, which use shared derived characters to reconstruct evolutionary relationships in an objective, repeatable way, has allowed paleontologists to produce more rigorous and more defensible hypotheses about temnospondyl phylogeny. The development of computed tomography scanning has allowed researchers to examine the internal structure of temnospondyl skulls in unprecedented detail, revealing features of the braincase, the inner ear, and the palate that are not visible on the surface of the specimen. And the discovery of new fossil material from previously poorly sampled regions, including Gondwanan localities in South America, Africa, and Australia, has added important new taxa and new data to the picture. Despite all of this progress, many questions about temnospondyl evolution remain open. The relationships among the major temnospondyl subgroups are still debated. The question of which temnospondyl lineage, if any, gave rise to modern amphibians is still unresolved, with different analyses supporting different hypotheses. The details of temnospondyl physiology, including their precise metabolic rates, their thermoregulatory abilities, and their sensory capabilities beyond the lateral line, remain poorly understood, and the behavior and ecology of most temnospondyl species can only be inferred indirectly from their anatomy and from the ecological context provided by associated fossil organisms. This incompleteness is not a cause for discouragement. It is a reminder that the study of deep time is necessarily an exercise in working with incomplete information, in building the most accurate possible picture from the evidence available while remaining honest about the limits of that evidence. The picture we have of the temnospondyls today is vastly richer and more detailed than the picture we had 50 years ago, and the picture we will have 50 years from now will be richer still, as new fossils are discovered, new techniques are developed, and new analytical frameworks are applied to old problems. Every new temnospondyl fossil is a piece of a puzzle that spans 200 million years and every continent on Earth. Every new analysis adds a line or two to a story that, despite being one of the longest in vertebrate paleontology, is still being written. and every student who looks at a Temnospondyl skull in a museum collection and starts asking questions is contributing to the ongoing project of recovering a world that vanished long before any human was there to witness it. There is one final aspect of the Temnospondyl story that we should address before we bring this documentary to a close, and that is the question of what the Temnospondyls can tell us about life itself, about the principles that govern the existence of living things on this planet and on any planet where life might arise. The Temnospondyls were, at their core, an expression of a strategy. The strategy was to specialize, to become extraordinarily good at one particular approach to obtaining food and surviving in a particular type of environment. That strategy worked for over 200 million years, through conditions that changed enormously over that time. The fact that it eventually failed, that the environment changed too much and too fast for the Temnospondyls to adapt, does not negate the success. It contextualizes it. Every living thing on Earth today is, in this sense, a Temnospondyl. Every species alive today is the current expression of a lineage that has been evolving for millions or hundreds of millions of years, adapting to the conditions that have prevailed during that time. Every species alive today has its own version of the Temnospondyl dependence on water, its own version of the flat skull and the ambush strategy, its own particular set of adaptations that work brilliantly under current conditions, but that represent vulnerabilities in the face of change. The oak tree is adapted to the temperate climate zone in which it thrives and would struggle in a tropical rainforest or an Arctic tundra. The great white shark is adapted to the cold, productive ocean waters where its prey is abundant and would quickly starve in a warm, oligotrophic sea. The monarch butterfly is adapted to the specific milkweed plants on which its caterpillars feed and the specific migratory routes that connect its breeding and wintering grounds, and is vulnerable to any disruption of those plants or those roots. The Temnospondyls remind us that evolutionary success is always contingent, always dependent on the continuation of the conditions under which that success was achieved. They remind us that even the most impressively successful lineages, even dynasties that have lasted for tens or hundreds of millions of years, can be brought low by sufficient environmental change. And they remind us that the creatures we see around us today, however numerous and however diverse and however well adapted they appear, are no more permanent than the Temnospondyls were. They are the current tenants of a planet that has been reshuffled many times before and will be reshuffled many times again. This is not a depressing thought. It is, or ought to be, a humbling and clarifying one. The history of life on Earth is not a story of progress toward the present, a teleological narrative in which every creature that has ever lived was a stepping stone to the organisms that exist today. It is a story of contingency, of adaptation and extinction and replacement, of lineages arising and flourishing and declining and disappearing over timescales that dwarf human history. The Temnospondyls were not prototypes for something better. They were not evolutionary experiments that failed. They were organisms, complete and functional and beautifully adapted to their world, that succeeded brilliantly on their own terms for as long as their world lasted. And when their world ended, they ended with it, as all things must. The proper response to the Temnospondyl story is not pity for their eventual extinction or admiration only for their long success. It is something more complex, something that combines both, a recognition of the achievement that their 200-million-year dynasty represents, and an acknowledgement that even such an achievement is ultimately subject to the indifferent forces of geological and climatic change. It is the recognition that life is always playing against deep time, and deep time always wins in the end. The light is fading now over the ancient swamps. The lycopsid trees are casting long shadows across the dark, tannin-stained water. Somewhere in the shallows, barely visible, a wide, flat shape lies motionless beneath the surface. Its lateral line organs are scanning the water. Its eyes, positioned on the top of its skull, catch the last light of a carboniferous day. It is waiting, as it has always waited, with the infinite patience of a predator perfectly matched to its world. It will wait here, and its descendants will wait in similar places for another 200 million years. It will survive fire and ice and catastrophe. It will outlast competitors and predators and the complete reorganization of the world's geography. It will adapt, within the limits of its body plan, to conditions that its ancestors could not have imagined. And it will, in the end, fade away not with a dramatic extinction, but with the quiet disappearance of the last member of the last population, in some warm, shallow, weed-choked bay, on a continent just beginning to take the shape we would recognize, under a sky already crossed by pterosaurs, overlooked by the indifferent dinosaurs grazing along the waterline. the Temnospondyls. For 200 million years, they ruled the water. They are gone now, their world vanished with them, their bones turned to stone and buried under hundreds of millions of years of younger rock. But they were here, they were real. They lived and hunted and died in their warm, dark swamps for longer than we can truly comprehend. And the fact that we know this, the fact that careful, patient human scientists have recovered enough of their story to reconstruct something of what they were and how they lived, is itself a kind of triumph, a triumph of curiosity over time, of knowledge over oblivion. The ancient swamps are gone, but the story remains. And in that story, in the flat-skulled, patient, extraordinary creatures that dominated this planet long before any creature we would recognize as familiar walked the earth, we can see something essential about the nature of life itself. Its adaptability, its resilience, its ultimate dependence on conditions it cannot control, and its capacity to generate, time and again, over millions and hundreds of millions of years. Forms of beauty and complexity and ecological sophistication that challenge our imagination and demand our respect. That is the story of the Temnospondyls. It is one of the greatest stories in the history of life on Earth, and it is only just beginning to be properly told. Thank you for joining us for this journey into the deep past, into the warm swamps and ancient rivers of a world 300 million years in the making. The Temnospondyls waited a long time to have their story told. We hope we have done them justice. If this documentary has sparked your curiosity about the ancient world before the dinosaurs, about the extraordinary diversity of life that flourished and faded long before any human existed to witness it, then we encourage you to explore further. Visit natural history museums. Read the work of the paleontologists who dedicate their careers to recovering these lost worlds from the evidence preserved in stone. Look at a pond or a river and try to imagine what it might have looked like 300 million years ago, teeming with forms of life that no longer exist, presided over by creatures whose patience and power and ecological dominance we have only recently begun to fully appreciate. The world before the dinosaurs was not a prelude. It was a story in its own right, rich and complex and full of wonders. The Temnospondyls were its greatest characters. And now at last they are beginning to get the recognition they deserve. Please share this documentary with anyone who loves the natural world and the history of life. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And be sure to subscribe so that you do not miss the next journey we take together into the deep, strange, magnificent history of life on Earth. The water is dark, the swamp is quiet, and somewhere beneath the surface something is waiting.